You also record it. Well, there we go. Good morning, folks. Welcome to the April 5th, 2024 Colorado Produced Water Consortium meeting. Appreciate everyone taking the time this morning to join us. I think we've got a pretty good agenda, lots of information that we got an opportunity to read over the last month. Appreciate everyone's input and participation in developing the final draft for deliverable 2. There was a lot of engagement on that, and really appreciate that work. But before we get started here, we do need to acknowledge our existence by doing a roll call. And so I'm going to call your name as I see you on the screen. If you could just indicate your name and the seat that you hold on the consortium, that helps us develop the record for the meeting. So I'm going to start with Irene Andrus.
Good morning, Irene Andrus, Environmental Justice.
Tessa?
Tessa Sorensen, Energy Liaison for CDPHE and Governing Body Member.
Brandy?
Brandy Honeycutt with CDPHE Water Quality Control Division.
Jeff?
Good morning, Jeff Kirtland, representing industry in the Piceance Basin.
Chloel?
Chloel Danforth, representing a nonprofit seat.
Eric?
Good morning, Eric Anglin, Occidental Petroleum, representing experience and expertise.
Ember?
Yay, Ember Michael, disproportionately impacted communities.
I see Mike, but you're under Marv Widener. So apparently you're our facilitator here today.
Well, hi everybody. I'm not sure why I've got the wrong name, but this is Mike Freeman with Earth Justice as a conservation group member. And I'll hop off and try and get back on. I may have used the wrong name.
Your name's fixed now.
Okay, great.
All right. Jolie?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Jolie Bronner, Environmental Justice.
Michelina?
Michelina Pollock with the Energy Council, representing industry in the San Juan Basin.
Sean?
Sean Strode, elected official, Western Colorado.
Jacob?
Good morning, Jacob Smith, Colorado Communities for Climate Action, Local Government Coalition. I think we're in a non-profit seat.
James?
James Rosenblum, Colorado School of Mines, academic seat.
Tracy?
Tracy Kozlov, State Engineer's Office and Governing Body.
Barbara?
Barbara Vasquez, representing Western Colorado Alliance.
Trisha?
Trisha Pfeiffer, US EPA Region 8, representing a federal seat.
Emma?
Emma Pinter, Adams County Commissioner, Local Government.
Kevin?
Kevin Chan, representing disproportionately impacted communities and people of color.
Clay? Clay, can you hear us? Maybe Clay is frozen. I'll go back to Clay. Mark?
Yeah, thank you, Mark Hefta, representing industry.
Okay. Harmony?
Harmony Cummings, representing environmental.
Okay. And I also want to acknowledge a new consortium member, which is Rick McCurdy. He's with Select Energy Services. He's taking over the role that Grant Tupper had taken with Select Energy Services. They had a organizational restructure. Rick comes to us with experience both with the Texas Produced Water Consortium as well as the New Mexico Produced Water Consortium. And Rick, I'll give you a second here just to introduce yourself to the consortium members.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy to see everyone and looking forward to meeting everyone that I do not currently know at the virtual meeting coming up in May.
In addition to the other two consortiums, I also represent Select Water Solutions, Commissioner.
Did I say Energy Solutions? I apologize.
On the National Alliance of Water Innovation, so the federal group looking into produced water. I've been in the industry as of about a week ago for 44 consecutive years now, with much of my time focused on produced water. Prior to joining Select Water Solutions, I was with Chesapeake Energy Services as a senior engineering advisor for 11 years, and helped lead Chesapeake in the role of reuse of produced water throughout their operations. So I've been involved in many various groups along with water. I represented Chesapeake to the API water team, also represented to several of the state water organizations, such as in Texas, the Texoga Water Committee, as well as an industry group called the Energy Water Alliance. So I look forward to contributing to the contribution. The one thing I would ask is Ms. Dalton has provided me links to all the previous meetings. Please give me a little leeway. I've been trying to catch up, but should I ask a question that was discussed several meetings ago, I hope you'll give me a little forgiveness for doing that. Thank you.
Of course, and welcome to the consortium. We're excited you're participating here with us. I note that as Rick was talking, we've got Nikki Wells that has joined us, as well as, well, I guess
I think we missed Barbara as well.
Barbara, did we miss you?
No, thank you. I already introduced myself.
Okay. With that, we will start into the agenda. Again, thanks everyone for being here today. I think we've got some really great presentations that are going to be happening today, as well as some discussions around both deliverable 2 as well as deliverable 3. And so a packed agenda as usual today. But I do want to kick it over to Director Dalton to give us some announcements and housekeeping, as well as introduction of some new staff.
Thank you, Chair Messner. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to say thank you to all of you. I know the pace of the work that we're doing is really fast, and it might not feel like you have enough time to even digest it. At least that's the way I personally feel. So I really appreciate all of your work and dedication to the consortium. So for the public, I wanted to say you can turn on captions. It's at the bottom of your screen. There may be an icon, or there's a little 3 dots that says more, and you can turn on the captions. For consortium members, just a reminder, we raise our hands to speak, and then Chair Messner calls on us, and generally mute your microphone when you're not speaking. And then if you can state your name before you speak, and that will help all of the people who are listening today and who may not be able to see your name. I often forget, so the reminder is for me as well as for you. And then thank you for everyone for using your cameras when you can. This allows people to see your facial expressions, and lip reading for those who are deaf or hard of hearing. And then just a reminder to take space and make space. If you're someone who speaks at meetings regularly, allow others the opportunity to speak before you do. And then for those of you who are normally quiet, please, I encourage you to find your voice and share all of your thoughts today. So that's my housekeeping. And then I wanted to pass the mic over to Nikki Wells, because Nikki will be hosting our first in-person meeting of the year. Nikki?
Good morning, Nikki Wells, representing the Disproportionate Neighborhoods and Nonprofits. Sorry guys, I was late today. I'm having some computer issues. Yes, like Hope said, I am happy to announce that me and Black and Brown Parents United Foundation will be hosting our first in-person Reproduce Water Consortium meeting in Aurora at the Dayton Opportunity Center. and hope we'll have some details to follow when we all get those together. So thank you guys. Good morning.
Good morning, Nikki, and thank you again for hosting. And for the general public that is on the call today, general public will be given an opportunity to come in person in May. And for our last meeting of the fiscal year in June, I'm going to hand it off to Commissioner Penter, who will be hosting.
Yes, just the same. Adams County is thrilled to be hosting the Produced Water Consortium. We'll make sure that the address is available in the agenda and, as Hope said, on the website. And we're thrilled to have you in one of our Adams County buildings, in one of our conference centers, to be able to continue this important work.
Thank you, Commissioner Penter. And now to introduce new staff. So House Bill 23-1242 provided for 4 staff. I'm one of them, and I'd like to introduce the other 3. So Erin Sedlacko comes from School of Mines, and she will be serving as Assistant Director for Research. She had a pre-planned vacation, but she is joining us just for this part to introduce herself. So Erin?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm having technical difficulties. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to start by saying thank you all for the meaningful and hard work this consortium has done so far. I'm super excited to be a part of your team. I know you can't see me because I'm in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas right now, but I recognize some of your faces, and I look forward to getting to know those that I don't recognize in the upcoming in-person meetings. I am Erin Sedlacko, the new Assistant Director for Research of the Colorado Produced Water Consortium. It's a mouthful, I know. And I come to you from Colorado School of Mines, where I was most recently the Research Director for Piceance Mines, as well as the Liquid Chromatography Mass Spectrometry, or LCMS, Lab Manager. I actually did my PhD research at Mines on the beneficial reuse of produced water and published a few papers on the topic with some of you here. So the consortium feels like a really good fit. The water energy nexus is close to my heart. Before that, I was vice president of an environmental consulting firm based in Denver, where I worked for 15 years on a wide variety of environmental health and safety projects. And I got to work with some pretty incredible people in some pretty incredible places. And way before that, I grew up in a polluted steel mining town called Youngstown, Ohio, where our rivers caught on fire. I never actually saw the river burning, but I did see the oil sheens on the water. And I remember thinking as a little girl how lucky we were to have rainbows in our water. I remember black ash falling from the sky from the mills like snow. And it wasn't really until I moved to Colorado in 2000 that I realized that these things aren't supposed to be normal. So Colorado really inspired me to become an environmental scientist, and I'm really excited to continue that work with all of you.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome. And
Thank
you
you.
can go back to your vacation now. But, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So Erin and I work for the Executive Director's Office in the Department of Natural Resources. The next 2 staff work at the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. And so Kat Campbell is our science advisor for data innovation. Some of you have already met with her, but Kat, are you on the line?
I am. Thank you, Hope. Hi, everyone. As Hope said, I'm Kat Campbell. I'm the Science Advisor for Data Innovation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've interacted with you guys mostly through comments on the deliverables, so it's nice to see faces and actually meet you. I've spent the past 17 years as a geologist in oil and gas, working throughout Colorado, the US, and around the world as a geologist. And my training is in geochemistry. Actually, my thesis work was on produced water in the Powder River Basin, trying to figure out what to do with the produced water. So a perfect fit for the consortium. Really excited to work with all you guys, and look forward to sharing my love of geology with you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Kat. And Kat does bring a wealth of information and talent in data visualization. So we're lucky to have you, Kat. Judy Sclafani is our data manager, and she's brand new and she's getting to know all of the ECMC data. And I couldn't be more excited to have Judy join the team. Judy, are you here?
Hi, I'm Judy Sclafani. I have been in academia for the past few years. My background is in Earth history and stratigraphy, and I use large databases and analyze them and sort of process them and manage them. And so I'm excited to bring those skills to the Produced Water Consortium and serve as the data manager for you all.
And Judy also teaches at the community college, right? And I think she has a doctorate in data analysis, correct?
I have a doctorate in geosciences. And yes, I do teach at the community college.
So we're really happy to have you on the team as well. So now we're fully staffed. Hopefully we can even serve the needs of the consortium even better. Back to you, Commissioner Messner.
Great. Thanks, Hope. And again, welcome all the new staff members, Aaron, Judy, Kat. Super exciting to have you here. What a wealth of knowledge that you bring to the consortium. And I feel pretty fortunate that we have the opportunity to work with you. So thanks for joining the team. I think next up on the agenda is public comment. We did not have anyone sign up for verbal public comment at the meeting today, but we did receive 2 written public comments that Director Dalton has provided to you via email, and appreciate the feedback from both Briz and Karen via written public comment. And I think all the consortium members have received that and have an opportunity to review it. And so thank you for providing your input on the processes as we continue the work that we're doing. And with that, unless Hope I'm forgetting anything, I think we'll just dive right into the final draft of the deliverable 2, which is regarding regulatory coordination. The legislation specifically states that by May 1st, 2024, the consortium will provide recommendations to state agencies and the General Assembly on how state and federal agencies can better coordinate regulatory policies related to produced water. There's been a ton of work that has been done on this, both by the staff of the consortium, as well as the different members of the consortium that have participated and provided comment on the drafts as we work through the process. And I'm going to kick it over to Hope to give you an overview of the final draft recommendations.
Thank you for everyone who contributed to the first draft, the second draft, and this is actually the third draft or final draft. And it grew from, I swear, a couple pages to over 60 pages. And we consulted with the subject matter experts on the regulations as per direction by the consortium. And so this is the culmination of all of the effort we've been putting into deliverable 2 over the past 3 months. And so on the screen, I just took all of the recommendations because today we'll be finalizing the recommendations, and I thought it might be easier for both the consortium members and the public to be able to see them on a slideshow. And so I think that Hannah, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll jump in. These are focused on state and federal coordination, recommendations for coordinating between state and federal agencies. And then we'll talk about the state, all agencies within the state that need coordination. And then there's some special considerations that I wasn't entirely sure where they would fit. They're currently in the background as special considerations. So I'm going to read our first recommendation, and then John, if you don't mind leading the discussion after. So our first,
just to clarify, I hope, do you want to go through all of them and then we can lead the discussion on them, or do you want to do it bullet by bullet?
I hadn't thought about it. I was thinking of bullet by bullet, but maybe going through all of them might be better approach.
Some of them kind of build off of each other. So maybe we'll go through all of them, and then we can always go back to the slides on specific ones if folks have questions or comments on modifications to those.
That's a great idea. And would you like me to read them all?
Sure, I mean, that'd be great.
Okay. So these aren't, I'm going to say the first recommendation, but they're not in any special order. So the first recommendation for state and federal coordination is to work towards a common understanding of the different terminology used across regulatory agencies and standard terminology in agency communications where possible. Review classification of produced water for consistency as an exploration and production waste or E&P waste, and as a resource for reuse. Next slide. This next one is to participate in the EPA's Water Reuse Action Plan, which is a collaborative national effort related to produced water. A potential action item may be to use existing data to create a geo platform that visually displays and identifies produced water generated, recycled, disposed, freshwater from the surface freshwater used, including volumes, locations, classification of water body, and any Endangered Species Act concerns, and then the amount of groundwater used. Next slide. The next recommendation is to develop a list of agency staff positions that work with the produced water and appropriate contact methods to facilitate streamlined answers to inquiries about produced water. This is the one-stop shop that people were trying to capture. The next one is develop a strategy of how the agencies will interact and intersect on issues related to decreasing freshwater use and increasing produced water use in oil and gas activities. Next slide. I believe this is the last one on state and federal agency coordination. Develop a list of agency staff positions. Well, that's a repeat, so apologies. We'll go to the next one, which is develop a strategy. Well, I don't know why. Apologies again. So the first two we've already talked about. The last two is coordinate use by regulatory agencies of data sources on produced water. And this might be the USGS produced water database, and increase consistency and transparency of those efforts. Consider use of cumulative impact assessments at both the state and federal levels to evaluate access to and development of produced water infrastructure. Next slide. John, do you want me to go through all of the state ones too? Or do we want to pause here?
Well, I'll kick it out to the consortium members. The folks, is it too much if we go through all the bullet points, or do we want to go through all the bullet points and then kind of go back with questions? We can go either way here. Does anyone, let me just ask, I guess, does anyone have any questions or comments or concerns with the bullets or recommendations that have been identified so far? Tracy?
Thank you, John. I guess I'll just mention that I had some pretty minor, what I would call clarifying comments that I went over to Hope earlier this week in writing. I don't know that they really have any consequence. So I'm not sure if you would want that here with the big group or if I should just leave it at that.
I think if there's some clarifying things, then certainly I think it'd be good to bring it up here, and then we can kind of reiterate that as a potential inclusion into the recommendations after the meeting today.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'm happy to either wait until Hope goes through the entire list or the ones, if my comments are on ones that she's already mentioned, I'm happy to mention that sooner rather than later, however you want to do it.
Maybe let's go through the rest of the bullets and see if perhaps they're not captured further on, and if they're not, then we can bring them up at the end of the presentation. Barbara?
Sorry, struggling to unmute myself. I think the idea of pausing in chunks through this presentation helps so that the questions are on topics that are fresh in everybody's mind from hearing it from Hope. And the one question I have is on the slide 6 about cumulative impacts. And I'm not quite sure, the state of Colorado is in the process of refining the definition of cumulative impacts and rulemaking. How does produced water fit into the cumulative impacts rulemaking? And there may not be an answer to that, but just posing that question since it's a moving target.
Sure. I mean, I can provide a brief comment on that. I mean, the rulemaking hasn't happened yet, and it's in a little bit of limbo right now based on some different things that are occurring at the General Assembly right now. And so I think that at least in the initial conversations around the cumulative impact rulemaking, there was some conversations that that ECMC would love to see the Produced Water Consortium work on some recommendations around cumulative impacts associated with produced water and provide recommendations to ECMC. If not in the rulemaking that's occurring at the end of April, or may occur at the end of April, but if not then at a later date when they would be addressing cumulative impacts associated with both fresh and produced water. And so I think a little bit to be determined, mostly because the rulemaking itself is a little bit in limbo right now as far as when that is actually going to occur. If it does look like it's going to occur further on, then there may be an opportunity to incorporate some recommendations from the consortium around cumulative impacts of freshwater or produced water into the rulemaking, depending on ultimately when it occurs.
I think you just identified the only positive in the chaos that's swirling around cumulative impacts right now. So thank you, John.
Right. Tricia?
Yeah, I was just going to follow on with the cumulative impacts component. I know we do work like that in the NEPA program, and it was one of the questions I had is when an application for freshwater withdrawal is submitted, is there a cumulative impacts analysis component to that? And is there a process to look for reuse opportunities of alternative water sources that could be used instead of fresh water? So I think you just touched on it for me too. So thank you.
Yeah. And I will also note that I think the cumulative impacts associated with water does tie also into some future deliverables that we have as per HB 23-1242. But I think we're also going to get a specific ask from ECMC to provide recommendations on the cumulative impact rulemaking as well. Harmony?
I want to say that we just received an email and it does look like the cumulative impacts rulemaking is being pushed.
It appears to me as well, but it's a constantly moving target, and so I hate to be certain on anything, but certainly the deadline.
I'll say it.
So, Rick?
Thank you, Commissioner. Just two comments. First of all, on the first slide, there was a comment regarding the understanding that produced water is a waste. In, I believe, the two meetings before this one, there was some discussion about reclassifying treated produced water as something other than produced water to aid with storage and reuse and things of that nature. In the written public comments that we had for this meeting, there was some commentary about carving out flowback water and not considering it produced water. We ran through this roughly about 15 years ago, and it was generally considered, it was considered by the API, it was discussed with the EPA, that any water that comes out of a well once completed would be considered produced water. And the reason for that is produced water has a RCRA hazardous waste exemption, and we have to be very careful with how we start reclassifying this water because it could potentially carve that portion of water out away from that exemption. And then when that happens, we have additional expense for how to dispose of it, additional concerns if we have a spill. And so industry as a whole doesn't consider flowback fluid as a fluid, it considers flowback as a process during the production period of that well. Second comment I have is the USGS database is a very good source, but it is dated. It doesn't have a lot of the modern unconventional water chemistry in it. So if we're going to use it as a basis, a database to work off of, we need an effort to try to get more information off the newer wells that are being produced into that database.
Good comments, Rick. Thank you. Tessa?
Yeah, just Tessa Sorensen, just to add on Rick's comments. I do think it's important to note that very specific phrasing on reclassification discussions is reclassification of treated produced water as that. That's a different flow stream. It's further down the process. It's like classifying potable water versus non-potable recycled water. Those are important classifications that have their own meanings. And so it's important, I think, that we talk about it in those terms.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts or comments on the bullets we've gone through up to this point? Tracy?
Thanks. So on the first slide, okay, the one we're looking at here, I guess I was just confused about what the second sentence is recommending.
Oh.
I knew you'd call on me. Thank you. So, Tracy, I think the second sentence was trying to capture the thoughts that Rick just shared, and but I'm beginning to hear from you and Tessa and Rick. It's really the terminology. So I would like to recommend that we remove that second sentence and just focus on a more general recommendation about understanding of different terminology. What do you think?
That works for me. I do see some nods of the people I can see.
Okay, then I'll remove that unless our conversation changes.
I see a couple of hands have come up though.
Emma?
Yeah, thank you. I take Rick's comment really seriously, and I think it does intersect with this issue of the state-federal agency coordination. I'm not really familiar, I'll be perfectly honest, with the exemptions granted under RCRA for federal hazardous waste management, and immediately started typing on my computer to try to pull that up so that I could understand it. You know, I mean, I think that's why the beautiful part of having normals like myself in this pot, because Rick and me that come with a lot of authority and a lot of background, and given your professional background, I assume a lot of expertise, but it just feels hasty. Like if we have federal guidance on point, it might be worth spending some time understanding the scope and breadth of that federal guidance on point before before just naming it and moving on.
I appreciate that, Commissioner. And correct me if I'm wrong, Hope, but my understanding of this particular bullet it's really was designed to, and I think it was based on some of the comments, Commissioner Pinter, that you had made previously, that a lot of different agencies use different terminologies in different ways that may mean the same thing, may not mean the same thing. There was just a lack of consistency as far as, what recycling means, what reuse means, what fit for use means, what beneficial use means, what, these different terminologies are. And I think the goal, at least my understanding in this bullet, was to try to have the different agencies work together to try to have a little more consistency in, what that terminology meant and how it's being utilized. Now, to the point that you made, though, I couldn't agree more. I think about some of our future deliverables, particularly around, barriers or ways to increase the amount of reuse and recycling and decrease the amount of fresh water that's being utilized. And, are there different techniques or strategies that this consortium may make recommendations on? And I think maybe having a presentation, even if it's from Rick or some of the other folks in the consortium on this particular topic of classification of produced water, I think would be helpful, as background information for us that we may be able to provide more specific recommendations in future deliverables. But that's just a thought, open to discussion.
That's great. Thank you for it. That was an accurate, that was your summary was my initial understanding of this bullet point as well. I think I was just thrown by Rick's comments.
Sure. Mike?
Thanks, John. I mean, I take Rick's point. I think it's a really important one. I would like to keep something in this report that flags the E&P waste classification as an important issue that we need to be thinking about. I don't think that necessarily we would want to remove, or that it would necessarily be that we would recommend, rethinking whether produced water would be characterized as a E&P waste. But whatever recommendations we may ultimately make in terms of how produced water is managed, the E&P waste exemption is going to be really relevant to that, and relevant to what the impacts are and what kind of improvements can be made. So I'm wondering if we could maybe wordsmith this a little bit to say something like, consider role of E&P waste classification as it affects produced water management, something like that, that flags that this needs to be considered and needs to be part of the assessment, but not suggest that we're considering a review of dropping that classification altogether, because I think Rick does raise an important point there.
Well, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. I think what I hear you saying is we want to acknowledge that because, again, this is state and federal agency coordination, that consistency and classification of produced water is an important consideration, right?
Right, exactly, and that the E&P
and that the specifics, as far as the conversations or debates or recommendations associated with, whether there needs to be different classifications or classifications need to stay the same, or whatever those conversations may be, would happen at a future date. But we're just acknowledging that consistency and classification of produced water is important as a element of coordination between state and federal agencies.
Right. That's definitely part of it. But I also think, naming the E&P waste classification as part of something we need to consider is, I think, worth keeping in our list here too, specifically.
Okay. Clay?
Thank you, Commissioner. A couple of things. I echo Mike's comments completely. I appreciate, and I think Rick's comments illuminate some of the complexities around classification of produced water. It's more than just a label. There's a lot that goes into the whole issue of it being held as an exemption under RCRA. And so those things are definitely things that are heavy-handed and need attention. But that's Tessa's point. We're not talking about just categorically reclassifying produced water. as if it's a non-waste material and there's no problems associated with it. But it does highlight the need to focus on this issue as one obvious and potential solution to increasing the use of produced water if we address, that classification standard. Now, as to whether the time exists or the appropriate hearing is the right place to deal with it, I totally concur with your caution there. I just think that if we don't highlight it and we take it out of the preliminary kind of works that we are moving toward making recommendations, then it may have a chance to lose its impact.
Okay. Barbara?
Yeah, just a very interesting conversation back and forth. Two things come to mind. It almost sounds like we need to create a glossary of terms and where we have some equivalents to identify those or non-equivalents across the different agencies. It'd be very helpful to all of us. But the second is this conversation about E&P waste, and RCRA brings forward for all of us. The question is, what is the threshold or the criteria where we can consider produced water no longer a waste? And in the view of people looking for reuse of produced water, if they are dealing with an E&P waste as opposed to a resource, that doesn't quite work. So I'm not quite sure how we get there. I think it's in future deliverables, but it really raises that question.
Yeah. Tracy?
Thanks. Thank you, John. So I guess two things. I would support that concept of the glossary of terms, and I guess I could imagine that being a recommendation that's not currently in the final draft, that agencies consider, providing their own individual glossaries, right? And then maybe staff can look for commonalities, or I'm just trying to think of a recommendation not too onerous on the agencies that could still be beneficial to the consortium. And then back to I had made the comment on that first recommendation and that I didn't understand the second sentence, and we've had good discussion on it. And I'll just note, I'm certainly comfortable if we want to keep a second sentence that talks about E&P waste. I just didn't understand it as currently written as someone outside of industry. So if we want to revise that second sentence of that first recommendation in a way that I guess can make sense to all of us, that would be fine with me. And while I have the floor, I just want to thank Hope and the staff for all the work you all have put into this.
Absolutely.
Great.
James?
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of add on. Yeah, I think the glossary is a great idea. And then just again, thinking about if there was some list or limit for treated produced water, not to lose that exemption. So we could, the context that I think about that in is in terms of storing water like we do on the Western Slope. So we could store up large volumes in lined pits if there was some quality of water that, reduced the risk of storing it. It's still salty water, but what does that look like? So large volumes can be stored, so we could try to achieve the percent recycle volumes that happen on the Western Slope. That's just in my head. That's how I think about this notion of it's still an E&P waste, but is there some level or some point where we get to something where it's, the risk is lower, it doesn't have hydrocarbons in it, or salty water with still organics, but a lower level that we're comfortable having in lined pits on this part of the state. So that they just wanted to kind of put that context. That's how I've been thinking about it, and this notion of treated, but that exemption piece that Rick talked about is very important.
Okay. And I wonder if we could go back to that first slide. Oh, we're there. This is it. So let me ask the consortium this. So right now it says work towards a common understanding of the different terminology used across regulatory agencies and standardized terminology and agency communications where possible. And so I think one outcome that's been discussed here today is a glossary, and just more consistency in terminology utilized. The second sentence says review classification of produced water for consistency as an exploration and production waste and as a resource for reuse. So my question to the consortium, I mean, does that not capture conceptually what we've been talking about here as a general recommendation? So we're not making a recommendation on whether or not to reclassify it or to, you know, what that consistent classification should be, but we're identifying to the state and federal agencies that we're encouraging them to review the classification for consistency as an E&P waste as a resource for reuse. So I guess my question is, does that not capture what we're talking about, or do we need to continue to wordsmith? Harmony?
I think the word that's missing for me somewhere, or some sort of concept, is treated produced water instead of just plain produced water. And I think that that's the part that I was like, ooh, so something in that vein.
Okay. Clay?
Yeah, Commissioner, thanks. I agree with Harmony. I was going to say something similar. The point I took about raising my hand earlier and having a comment was in response to the idea of extracting it from the bullet altogether. So I agree that keeping it, I think it adequately addresses the issue. Maybe to revise it to say treated produced water would be a good idea.
Okay. Irene?
Hi, thank you. Irene Andrus of Environmental Justice. I think that the comment about the produced water, that's an example of something that we want to include in the glossary to get clear. But I think that defining it right now is outside the scope of this deliverable.
I think that's right. Yeah. Rick?
So real briefly, I agree with Irene. I think the bullet is written defines how we look at produced water today as an industry. If we move forward with as James was mentioning a minute ago, and so did Clay, if we're going to treat a water to some standard to where we feel like it can be safely held in an open air impoundment, so we're going to remove a lot of the organics and the volatiles out of it as well as iron, then we need to give that a label, as Harmony said, treated produced water, and then we need to create a definition for what that means and how that define. It's still a produced water, but this is how it's different than a raw produced water, right? Now, in the future, as we look to the potential to recover some sort of water that's of a high quality that can be used for beneficial use outside of the industry, then we need to get into a discussion about, is there a way to de-waste that water so it's disassociated away from produced water and is looked at something completely different? But as far as just removing a few of the organics, we just need to create a name. Treated produced water is fine, but then create a definition within the state of Colorado as to what that means.
Okay. So I think what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is Hope, I think we need to add treated in there. Keep the second sentence, include the word treated. And I hear Rick saying that we want to develop or want to encourage a definition. I'm not sure. Again, this deliverable talks about the coordination between state and federal agencies to better streamline processes. We do have a future deliverable that talks about barriers to reuse and recycling of produced water. And I think one of the barriers that at least had been identified in previous discussions was, classification of produced water, just generally. So no opinion whether it should be reclassified or it should stay the same or whatever, but that was identified as a barrier. And so I think potentially that definition or that specificity onto recommendations around barriers and potential solutions to those barriers may be best handled in a future deliverable. If we want to identify that that a definition should be created, so we're encouraging state and federal agencies to develop that, we could put that in here, but I guess my concern is that then we're basically asking the agencies to define it. Whereas I think it might be beneficial for us to take the time to see if we have a recommendation for a definition or a suggestion, which could happen in a future meeting. So again, these are just thoughts of mine, and it's always hard to wordsmith stuff in a public meeting. But I see a bunch of hands up. So Trish, I think you were had your hand up first.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. For me, I would like to better understand, so identify the regulatory barriers that are driving the discussion for the need to reclassify. I don't feel like I have a good understanding of that piece.
Yeah, well, I think we again, I think that is it's coming. It's coming in another month or two. We've got a whole topic on it, and we do have to identify those, and that's going to be a big conversation. I think that having a presentation, as you know, we talked about earlier from some folks in the consortium about current classification and exemptions would be helpful in informing us for that conversation.
Yep, that sounds good. Thank you.
Emma?
Yes, I completely agree, and I'll also be brief. I think that us working through our own series of definitions will be relevant for the state of Colorado, because while we are nested under the EPA from a regulatory perspective, federal then state, their regulations could change at any time. So while we're mindful of what's going on there, we need to have our own body of regulations and guidance.
Okay. Chloe?
Yeah, and recognizing that, sorry, Chloe Danforth, and recognizing that this is probably a conversation for a later deliverable. The definition of treated produced water is going to be tricky, and treated to what standard is it appropriate for what we're talking about? So I just want to put a flag out there that treated is not a cut and dry definition, and is really context specific. So.
Agreed. Clay and Harmony, you both still have your hands up. Is that from previously, or you got additional thoughts? You're breaking up, Clay. We can't hear you.
I'm addressing this issue. My bad. Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I have to point out that I was one of the proponents, and maybe even a suggestion for this inclusion of this comment. But one of the things in that original comment was, and according to specified standards. So I think the comment is well taken. Just was highlighted.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll put a pin in this one for right now. Give Hope a chance to think about it a little bit, and maybe we can move on to the rest of the presentation, and then have a conversation about that, and we'll circle back to this.
Hannah, I think we left off on slide 6, state agency coordination. So these recommendations were based on different agencies working together. So we saw a presentation about the produced water roadmap. And so we're going to build on the success of the produced water roadmap. I'm sorry, I should have started at the beginning. My apologies. Streamline regulation and permitting of the use of recycled water for oil and gas operations by building on the success of the produced water roadmap. The produced water roadmap was a collaboration between Hazardous Materials and Waste Management Division and Energy and Carbon Management Commission. Those are within DNR and the State Health Department. By updating or combining with the produced water recycling flow chart, which was an informal guidance developed in 2016, and this flow chart included the Division of Water Resources in a collaborative effort. The next one is to review the rulemaking processes, regulations, and permitting processes to reduce duplication and highlight opportunities for collaboration. Specifically include the robust reporting and monitoring requirements and when the ownership of produced water from oil and gas activities may change. Next slide. Explore using the Colorado Information Marketplace or a similar common database, website portal, or other point of access to support transparency to the public and industry across the multiple agencies that are involved in produced water regulation. Work together and share information about leaks, spill response, and remediation through MOUs or other similar methods. Next slide. Revisit current MOUs and MOAs between state agencies and or federal agencies and update as necessary and appropriate. I think we need a little wordsmithing there, but to improve coordination for produced water. A focus should be to identify areas of or points of regulatory overlap regarding the oversight and management of produced water and reduce or eliminate the redundancies when feasible. The reason you see kind of duplication here is consistent feedback that the MOUs and MOAs were created even as long ago as the 1980s, and so they do need to be revisited. Next slide. Review the list of water quality analytes and analysis procedures in Rules 909J 1 through 5 that are required by the ECMC 800 series in consideration of known and reasonably anticipated concerns related to the recycling and reuse of produced water. The next one is build on the success of the environmental justice group at CDPHE by identifying a single point of contact to route, take action, and respond to environmental justice questions and concerns about produced water. And I believe that's the end of our state to state, and we go on to the special considerations. Would you like to have a discussion about the state to state coordination?
Yeah, I think it's a good pausing point. So there was a group of stuff there. So thoughts, reactions to the last presentation. Mike?
Thanks, Chair Messner. Hope, thanks for these. And I think I don't have any substantive concerns with these recommendations. I'm actually really like the work that's gone into them, and I think we've got a good list of meaningful suggestions. I would suggest, or at least maybe raise the option of a little bit of wording, editing with regard to slides 6 and 8. In both of those, there's language about streamlining regulations and reducing duplication. And I think that's certainly a worthy effort to look at and worth helping to better coordinate what agencies are doing. But in terms of how this report will be received, talking about eliminating redundancy and streamlining regs is perceived by a lot of people and a lot of members of the public as kind of shorthand for weakening regulations, or in some cases really strongly weakening them. And we see this all the time in the work I do, that efforts to really block improved regulations or weaken them usually often get put under the umbrella of duplication and streamlining. And I don't say that to suggest that this is not a worthy goal, but I'm wondering if we can wordsmith this a little bit to take out those kind of red flag terms and use something like refine, or maybe if we're going to say streamline, add while maintaining, full protections and careful treatment of it, just so that this doesn't get perceived by the public as saying we're calling for weakening existing protections, basically.
Thanks for those thoughts, Mike. I think they're good, and I don't think there's any intent from anyone who has participated in this to weaken it. And so I do think it was really to refine and eliminate duplication or replication within the rules. And so
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think that's a good suggestion for terminology. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. Jeff Kirtland. On slide 9, just a comment. I think on this slide we're looking at, there's a bit of specificity with respect to the slide 9 is the one that mentions the 909J analyte review with respect to ECMC 800 rule, and I believe that implies the enhanced recovery aspects that are covered in Rule 800 series. I'm just wondering if really the intent of this is just to be more general with respect to the analysis and the analytes and water quality overall, and how ECMC coordinates with other agencies. I was a bit confused by just the specific reference to the 800 series. There's a lot of intersect with 909J in a lot of what operators are dealing with respect to pits and other things. 800 series, from my perspective, really covers underground injection and enhanced recovery, which there's not a lot of that going on. So just kind of wondering if that's too specific of a comment.
Oh.
I think I'd rather work with you offline to wordsmith it, just so that I can capture everything that you're trying to express. Is that okay? Okay.
Tracy?
Thank you, John. For the recommendation that says develop a strategy of how the agencies will intersect on issues related to decreasing freshwater use and increasing produced water use in oil and gas. It sounds like a good recommendation. I was just wondering, is that a strategy for after the consortium has concluded its work, or I was trying to understand. It feels to me like right now the consortium is the vehicle where we're interacting and intersecting. So are we thinking something beyond the consortium? I don't know if there's any more specificity we could add to that.
Can we get to that slide?
Yes, can you tell me which number it is? I'm sorry.
I don't know your slide number.
No worries. Can you tell me what like the first line was?
It says develop a list of, sorry, that's the wrong one. Develop a strategy of how the agencies will interact.
Okay, I got it. It's 4.
Sorry about that.
No worries at all. I'm working to try to get that added and I can't figure it out. Is this the right one?
Yes.
The strategy?
Yeah, to the bottom one. And again, I'll just say, I have thought that the way right now that we're interacting and intersecting is the consortium. So do we want something in parallel to the consortium, or if the consortium ends after the consortium is concluded? I guess it feels like we're doing it right now, I guess, in the consortium. So what are we thinking? What else are we looking for?
I think it's a good question. And I hope, I'm not sure where this recommendation was generated from, and so maybe you could provide a little insight on that, and then we can have a little discussion on it.
So this recommendation was developed out of I don't know, the concept that state and federal agencies work in silos. And so the strategy would be the example that was given is spills, right? You report the spills to one agency, or maybe you report the spill to 3 agencies. And how do you coordinate a response where all agencies know what is the reaction and remediation and follow-up? So that is kind of the background on the development of this recommendation.
Okay, so understanding that, I mean, it does appear that the bullet talks more about kind of identifying strategies to decrease freshwater use and increase produced water use, which, I mean, I would agree with Tracy. I mean, that's kind of what we're for as the consortium. And so maybe that bullet could talk a little more about you know, clarification on how agencies can coordinate you know, reporting requirements or you know, I'm terrible at wordsmithing things on the go, so I'm not coming up with anything good, but you guys are all smarter than I, so you'll come up with something. Tracy?
I guess I just thought was that because it does have really the goal of the consortium, which is the end of that sentence, is the thought if the consortium were to end, that the agencies should continue their coordination efforts along these lines. I think that would be fine, but it just seems like you're asking agencies to not only be involved in the consortium right now and in the next year or however long, but also do something separate and in parallel in addition, which I feel like is asking a lot of the agencies who already have a lot of things they need to do. And so I want to avoid us making a recommendation that's saying they should do more, I guess, than what they're doing, contributing to the consortium while the consortium is still functional.
Okay. Irene?
Based on what everyone just said, I'm wondering if what you're trying to say is develop a single source of truth for shared reporting and data. Is that what you're trying to get to, that there is a single source of truth, that everybody is hitting the same data when they're trying to, when they're gathering the information from a report?
Oh.
I believe that's a question for me, Hope Dalton, Director. So I think what I'm hearing is we could potentially delete it as the consortium is recognizing that the consortium is the strategy that agencies will use to intersect on the issues, and we could put that into the background or create a theme throughout the document that the consortium is this mechanism for agency coordination. I mean, I think your idea about data coordination is being captured in the recommendation that mentioned the Colorado marketplace.
Okay. I think it's a good suggestion, Hope. Unless folks have any concerns about it, we'll let Hope work on that, and I think capture the conversation we've had here on that particular topic. Other thoughts on the bullets we just went through, or should we go on to the next set of bullets?
I do have one more.
Oh, sorry, Tracy. I see you now.
I'm sorry. Thank you. And this would be the recommendation: review rulemaking processes, regulations, and permitting processes. I'm sorry, I don't know the slide number.
Sorry, can you tell me what the first sentence of that one was?
Of course.
Number 6.
Thank you. Review rulemaking processes, regulations. Yeah, great. On the bottom one. And then in the second sentence, specifically include robust reporting and monitoring requirements, and when the ownership of produced water from oil and gas activities may change. This part about ownership, I don't understand what we're looking for here. So sentence 1, reduce duplication and highlight opportunities for collaboration. That seems fine. But what are we wanting to do regarding ownership? Are we trying to?
I can tell you a little background, Tracy. This is Hope Dalton, Director. So the concept is that I was trying to capture is if produced water in the future becomes treated as a resource. So we'll say critical minerals are mined from produced water. The produced water is no longer owned by the operator that created the produced water. It would be owned by someone who is trying to mine the minerals. And so what I'm trying to capture here is the whole life cycle of produced water, we'll pretend in this case from, surface water might be the beginning source, and then it's used to develop a well, and then it comes as produced water, then that produced water is exchanged in some manner, and where does it go?
Are we seeking to clarify questions that currently exist around ownership changes?
I think that's a better way of stating it, yes.
Okay, I think that would be fair. I just didn't understand what we wanted to do around ownership. Thank you.
Rick?
Yeah, just briefly following on with that, as we in the future get into a discussion of ownership changes, that discussion should not only include that whatever minerals are in the water becomes the property of the new owner, but the liability of that water would also be put upon the new owner as well.
Right. Right. Jolie?
I just want to flag in combination with Rick's comments, I agree. And it's that piece we talked about in our last meeting of not ownership of the resource itself, but responsibility for the additives. And so I just wanted to clarify that statement because we had a long conversation on this where I think that's where this bullet point started to develop from. So I wanted to call our attention back to that, agree with what Rick said, and then elevate kind of the clarity of what we had talked about for a while in our last meeting, I believe. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Tracy?
So just in terms of the wording of the recommendation, is it something more like clarify around the ownership and the liability of, I don't know what, XXX, something around the liability?
I think that's right. And I think Hope can come up with some language that captures that. And so maybe we'll put a pin in that one and move on to the next ones, and then we'll come back and review some of these one more time. Is that okay, Hope?
Yes, I'm taking notes, and yes, I'll reach out to consortium members and make sure that I captured all of their voices.
Okay, well, let's move on to the last bullets.
So these originally were in a long list of recommendations for I just grouped them as multi-agency recommendations for coordination, but they were a little bit outside of the scope of the regulatory coordination because they're not easily tied to a regulation. So I've elevated them to earlier in the document and calling them special considerations. And I'm open to moving them to a better place or just revisiting them as recommendations. So the first one is identify and explore cost as a potential hurdle for produced water reuse and recycling. The next one is building produced water treatment facilities within or near communities can create revenue streams. Identify the potential of incentives that support community development, such as establishing a preferential hiring clause or a local workforce percentage requirement, which can enhance community engagement and support the local economy. Next slide. Reusing treated water for agriculture may have the potential to benefit both the environment and local farmers if challenges facing characterization and treatment of contaminants in produced water can be overcome. Identify the potential of offering incentives to agricultural producers to further encourage participation and foster agricultural sustainability. Next slide. Identifying contaminants of concern, minimum acceptable concentrations of those contaminants, and define analytical methods to determine those concentrations based on potential intended fate outside of the oil and gas industry. I will highlight this one is our last deliverable that's due July 1st, 2025. And then the next one is identify responsibility and liability related to contaminants and waste produced when treating and using produced water while considering the fate of produced water and the waste stream. And I think I have one more slide. Identifying options for produced water storage and transportation that help minimize their carbon footprint while enhancing their utility may help accomplish the goals of reducing operators' dependency and use of fresh water by increasing the use of produced water in oil field applications. I'd like to hand it back to you, Commissioner Messner. If you're speaking, John.
No, I was speaking eloquently, but now I'm just going to hand it to Jolie.
I'll try to be as eloquent as you just were in that segue right there. Thank you, John. Can we please go back to the first slide in this section to look at bullet point number 2, please? I love the pieces on the hiring clause, local workforce percentage. A lot of that is reflected from our conversations. Is there a way we can add to this bullet point something along the lines of community input and control if we are going to be adding produced water treatment facilities within or near communities can create these revenue streams? If there's going to be any new creation, can there be a caveat in this bullet point about community listening, community input, some sort of town hall where people can learn more about what that means for their community if we are doing any sort of changes to their community makeup and what they can expect there. We can discuss that bullet point further. I just kind of wanted to flag that as we didn't really have the buy-in from the folks who this could be revenue stream for them, but that autonomy to decide, yes, that is a work I would like to do. I think that's great for my community. Thank you.
I think those are good considerations. I do want to make one quick comment before I go to Brandy, but I think that these bullets in this last section are all important topics and considerations for us to consider, to chew on, to make recommendations on, to fully to flesh out. I'm trying to figure out how these tie directly into this this particular deliverable, which again is specific to how federal and state agencies can better coordinate. And so I think that's what I'm struggling with a little bit. And I know that Hope you had talked about having these special considerations kind of in the background or identifying them as topics that we're going to be, talking more about or considering. And, not losing these topics, because these topics are important and I think are an important part of our conversation. But I guess I'm struggling a little bit to see how that's a direct recommendation to state and federal agencies, how they can better coordinate. So that's my initial thought on that, but I'm certainly open to hear additional thoughts on that. So Brandy?
Yeah, I had a comment on the bullet about identify contaminants of concern, minimum acceptable concentrations, that whole thing. It seems to me that we're looking at, kind of figuring out what's in the water and how much treatment is needed for what we want to use it for, that being a variety of uses. Am I analyzing that correctly?
That's the way I read it.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that in the reuse world, we have a term for that, and it's called fit for purpose. And so if it's just a wordsmithing thing, but and I didn't catch this, I apologize in my review, but if we wanted to use reuse terminology, that would be considered like a fit for purpose use and for the intended fate outside of the oil and gas industry. Just if we wanted to wordsmith and be in line with the reuse world a little bit, that's all.
Thanks for that. Barbara?
Yeah, thanks, Chair Messner, Barbara Vasquez. On the comment on slide 11 about reusing treated, it says water, I think you mean produced water for ag. I think in any reuse outside of oil and gas, there are general issues that we all recognize in terms of coming to an agreement what the allowable contaminant load would be. And in regards to this particular deliverable, when we're looking at federal and state agency coordination, my question would be, from the EPA's point of view, is there a good understanding or a recommendation that could flow to the state that would be valuable here for reuse outside of oil and gas industry?
Thanks, Barbara. I do think that's on our plate, and I think that is on our plate. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hope, but by July of 2025. Yeah.
That's correct. In general, 2024 is focused on in-field uses, and 2025 is when we really explore outside the oil field. And that's a huge generalization.
It's enormous, and I'm suggesting maybe the special consideration element be removed, in that we know we have that coming. It's a huge issue nationally and internationally. I see Rick nodding his head, and it's premature in this interagency coordination deliverable, in my opinion.
Other thoughts? Eric?
Oh, yes, thank you, Eric England. I wanted to just make a comment on top of Julie's comment on that first slide of special considerations, the second bullet point. If we were able to go back to that slide.
Sorry about that. Can you tell me either the slide number or what was the top part of it again?
I apologize. It was the first slide we covered in this section.
Oh, okay. Good. That one.
Yes, correct. And again, not necessarily answering Commissioner Messner comments about how much of this would be included in this, but I did want to just mention we are focusing in the second bullet on produced water treatment facilities and those potential positive impacts, but maybe we would frame it just as the additional developed use of produced water, because that could mean more than just treatment facilities, but those same kind of advances in that additional use of produced water are what could lead to those positive impacts and additional workforce opportunities within communities.
I think that's a fair statement, yeah. Rick?
Yes, so Commissioner Messner, I agree with your comments earlier about these are excellent bullets, many of these in here. Not for sure they're appropriate for this May 1st deliverable. Many of them look like they would be appropriate for the July 1st deliverable. So we may want to take a look at moving some of these to that deliverable. And then the second comment, and it had to do with, once again, the definition. And when we talk about produced water versus treated produced water, well, currently right now, and this isn't formal, but we're generally describing treated produced water for reuse in oil and gas operations. And that water is still going to have a lot of the same salts and minerals as produced water itself does. We're not removing that out. We're just removing things out, such as a lot of the organics, the iron, the suspended solids that are in it, but it wouldn't be appropriate for agriculture. So down the road, when we start getting into that discussion, now we're going to have to come up with a third definition, whether it be an RO permeate or a distillate or something like that, because that water is going to be completely different than what we started with. And that ends that comment.
Thanks, Rick. Jolie?
Perfect timing, going right after Rick. I had a comment on the ag, and just a flag. As we talk through this point, I'm willing, or I guess I'll make two different comments. I'm willing to bump things to the July 1st deliverable if it makes sense to be in that one when we talk about community listening, community buy-in, and community participation. Just wanted to flag to make sure it stays at the forefront. What I will say, since we're focusing on departmental coordination and how departments work together, we may want to keep something around agriculture in here if we're considering any input from the Colorado Department of Agriculture. When we start talking about water use, I do a ton of work in soil health testing and water use in agriculture, and they have programs that we could align with the Colorado Department of Agriculture, where they have water sensors in place for certain producers, where they have certain things, and that might be a great thing to keep it in here, so we can continue to coordinate with that other department. And then that last piece, when we talk about how departments interact with community. So we're not listening to community to death. People aren't getting the same surveys. We're not missing community. There may be a good reason when we talk about interdepartmental coordination to keep a piece about how we connect to community. Thanks.
A good point. Chloe?
Hi, yeah, just returning, sorry, Chloe Danforth, HEI Energy. Just going back to slide 12. The second point about offering, or maybe it's just the one point. Maybe it isn't slide 12. Offering incentive for agricultural use without, I just wanted to echo and elevate Barbara's point about maybe this is a little premature. If we offer incentives about something that we don't really have a full grasp of what's in the produced water, I think it creates a potential for, and I think I'm using this term correctly, a moral hazard. And I defer to lawyers on this one because I think it has a real definition that I don't quite understand the full of, but you know, it's creating liability where we don't really understand what either party could be liable for. So I just want to say that maybe that should be tempered or put off or just considered a little bit more deeply. Thank you.
Sure. And I know it's a controversial topic, and it's a broad and important topic, and it's certainly one that we'll have conversations about. I do think that there's some challenges with having it so far up in our deliverable process. I think, again, as far as the perception of folks that will initially read this, I think some people may come to the conclusion that we've already had a discussion about some of these topics if they are prominent in the recommendations in this particular deliverable, which is really focused on identifying how agencies better coordinate amongst each other. I also don't want to lose these topics as acknowledging that these are topics that we're going to have conversations on in the future. And so I think initially, Hope, you had talked about having some of these topics just discussed in some of the background. And I wonder what the consortium thinks about keeping them in the background, just as topics to inform folks that, you know, while this deliverable is on how agencies better coordinate with one another, that we're acknowledging that the consortium will continue to have these conversations on some of these other topics. There are additional deliverables that we'll be working on in 2024 and 2025, and just acknowledging that they exist. but not necessarily having them as bulleted recommendations in this particular deliverable. Does anyone have heartburn about that thought, Barbara?
The only comment I'd make, John, and I like your idea of putting it in the background, is to be sure to put the biggest emphasis of our work on reuse within industry, and if the technology and the analytical capabilities support it, to look at recycling and reuse outside of industry. But that's clearly in 1242 and in our mandate from the legislature, a secondary and future question. And just want to make sure that nobody who reads this deliverable gets the misimpression that we're prioritizing this now, because we're not there yet.
I think that's fair, and I think it's a good point. I do have a question for Jolie on this particular slide, because I think that your point on how agencies can better coordinate amongst each other and how they connect to community, I think is a good point. I guess my question is that there was a previous bullet that talked about implementing some of the suggestions provided by the Environmental Justice Task Force on how to better connect with community, or I guess that one did talk more about having a central point of contact for environmental justice concerns and not specifically on coordination and connecting to community. Should we include this piece as a recommendation? Because I think it is an applicable recommendation for state and federal agency coordination, but I'm not sure it's fully captured by the environmental justice bullet that is a recommendation. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's why I made the comment. I love the EJ task force bullet. I would love for that to stay in there. I think the work they did is important, and also how they've done their report and worked with the state. So I'd love to keep that as a separate bullet point, because their work is kind of like the Environmental Justice Task Force and their report. As I said before, I'm comfortable and recognize that I don't want us to get too ahead of ourselves when we have a schedule for deliverables. It's that I want to make sure that I like this idea of we are considering these things the whole time. You cannot tack on community, equity, inclusion at the end. We have to include it through the whole process. And so that's why I make these points when we have this of like, how do we make it so we show that we are considering this the whole way through? And that's the goal of those comments, not to burden our conversation or slow us down. So what I'll say is, like this bullet point, I'm comfortable moving some of the community involvement stuff to July if we need to, but maybe a bullet point on how we recognize the importance of, cross-departmental collaboration when working with constituents, communities, the people of Colorado, and how we connect to them and show up in their spaces. So I'm comfortable with wordsmithing that offline. Hope if you want to email me, we can chat through it, but I don't want to add anything that doesn't have the full buy-in from everyone in the room that we can chat through. So I'm comfortable continuing to talk about it, but that was the motivating factor behind it.
So as one consortium member, I like that idea. I think that is very relevant to the deliverable that we're working on how state and federal agencies can better coordinate. I think having, interagency coordination as far as how they outreach community is certainly a good consideration. So I want to throw it out to the consortium before we consider having Jolie work with Hope on creating a bullet for this under state agency coordination. Does anyone have any heartburn or doesn't want to see that happen? Clay? You're muted, Clay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm trying to run this off a phone today. My apologies. No heartburn about that. I did want to echo and applaud Jolie's comments about inclusion of the comments, particularly as it relates to including the Department of Agriculture. Notwithstanding, it's premature to the overall process, but maybe an idea is to put a subgroup together to better understand how, for this particular topic, interagency coordination could be utilized as an educational thing for a future meeting for the overall consortium, because it may take more than just a tacit review of those considerations at that point in time.
Okay, good thoughts. So understanding our time, Hope, I'm gonna ask maybe if you would provide some recommendations on how you would like to proceed on the conversation here. I do want to kind of just give an overview of some of the changes or suggestions that have been made as you understand it. If you need any additional direction or clarification from the consortium, I am going to ask consortium members after that conversation whether or not they feel like their voices have been heard in this particular deliverable to allow Hope and the rest of the staff to be able to move forward with this, understanding we have a May 1st deadline on this one, and this will be our last formal review of this as a consortium before it's required to be delivered. So Hope, can I kick it over to you?
Yes, so that was great. Hannah, if you want to start at the beginning on slide 2. So slide 2 is, there's a recommendation essentially around terminology. So I'm going to include the word treated and also create another recommendation to create a glossary of terms. And you can interrupt me if you want, if I haven't captured that.
Let's just go through them all, and then we'll
okay. Thank you.
Raise our hands. Yeah.
Next slide is about the wrap, and I heard no comments on that, so we'll keep it as is. The next slide is, there is comments about moving the develop a strategy of how agencies will interact to the background, and I'm going to, so next slide, Hannah. I'm going to move the develop a strategy of how, well, I'm actually just going to delete it and incorporate into the background that the Colorado Produced Water Consortium is the mechanism for interacting between agencies on decreasing freshwater use. And
hey, Hannah, can you jump to slide 4, please?
Sorry, did I go to the right one? Or
you're on 3 right now.
Sorry, 4 then?
Yep, thanks.
Sorry.
So I'm going to incorporate that as part of the background and really emphasize that the consortium is that mechanism. Next slide, Emma. There weren't any changes recommended, although we had some comments. I think I might just remove the example of the USGS produced water database and just leave it a little more vague. And next slide. I think everybody is in agreement about creating more roadmaps similar to the produced water roadmap and updating the flow chart. So no changes there. And then I'm going to work with Tracy, Jolie, and Rick on wordsmithing that. I think there's probably 2 recommendations related to this streamlining of regulations. Next slide. There weren't any updates, updates needed for creating a common database or working together on response to spills. Next slide. The same this is the bullet that I was referring to about the MOUs and MOAs, and I'll work with the consortium members identified to update that. Next slide. I didn't put it on this slide, but I have it in my notes to work with. Well, I can't find it right now, but I have in my notes to work with the consortium member that had comments on 909J. Excuse me?
Jeff.
Jeff, thank you. I'll work with Jeff on 909J, and I'm going to work with Jolie to really capture the concept of community. There was a misspelling, but it's community engagement into this recommendation, as well as what we'll talk about in this special considerations. Next slide. There's no change to the first special considerations, and special considerations will no longer be recommendations, but they will be in the background and highlighted that the consortium will continue to explore these topics. And there's another opportunity to explore these topics, because in September 1st, we have a deliverable due about priority topics. And I think that might be an opportunity for us to revisit these important topics before the July 1st, 2025 deliverable, which is focused on analytical methods. The one that I'm going to be working with Jolie and Eric on is really the development of produced water instead of focus on just the facilities. Next slide. This one about agriculture, I would like Commissioner Messner if we could revisit this again, but I need to know whether we should delete it or if we should massage the language.
Okay.
And the next slide. Again, we're still in the background with special considerations. I'm going to work with Brandy on using the same terminology that's used in the reuse world, fit for purpose. There will be no change to the responsibility and liability comment. And then the final slide. There was no change to this pipeline.
Okay, thanks, Hope. Way to capture all of that. And thanks everyone for their input on it. Barbara, you had your hand up.
Yeah, if I might, thank you, Chair Messner. I have a couple of comments. First on slide, I believe it was 4. So I respect Commissioner Kozlov's comment that the Colorado Produced Water Consortium provides this structure for coordination between both federal and state and local agencies with the representation we have on the Produced Water Consortium. But my question for my fellow commissioners that represent those agencies is, do you think something in addition is needed to focus on the actual day-to-day work on collaboration and coordination on permitting, enforcement, et cetera, that will actually make all of this work? So that's one question. And then if people want to respond, I have a comment on the special consideration ag section.
So thoughts on Barbara's comment on this highlighted bullet? Tracy?
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara, for your comment. I guess I would say the short answer is no. I wonder what becomes of these recommendations that will be made in the report. They're recommending that the agencies do a number of things. I don't know if those end up being in legislation, but I really hesitate to ask agencies to do more beyond this current participation and trying to implement the recommendations this report is going to make. So I'd be comfortable if this recommendation mentions something, if the consortium were to end, that the agencies should continue on at that point, but to ask agencies to do more than what we're already doing, I think is a big ask.
But do you envision rulemaking that would come out of the Produced Water Consortium recommendations in various agencies?
For I could only really speak for DWR. I would say I don't see one with what the recommendations are right now, but I do see that we're going to do things like try to have something like an improved roadmap, for instance, or flow chart. There are a number of things that we're going to do. I'm not sure about the other agencies.
Barbara, let me ask you this question. I mean, I understand what you're trying to get to, and I do think that there's going to be other deliverables that, you know, are going to identify barriers, and it could be that, you know, coordination with permitting might be a potential barrier. I'm not saying it is, I'm just making stuff up. And there may be more specificity in those recommendations than we may be able to offer in this particular one. And so I wonder, at least for our purposes in this particular deliverable, whether just eliminating this one might be appropriate, understanding that we're not eliminating the conversation on this, but it might be captured in 2 or 3 other deliverables that are further along here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think part of 1242 directs us to provide recommendations to ECMC and CDPHE, among others, regarding rulemaking. And so that would follow on from those recommendations. So thank you, Commissioner Messner. And the other comment on ag, if we could go to that special consideration slide, I'm wondering if we're not better served if we want to keep something like this in a background, is not to focus on ag, but to just talk about potential future use outside of oil and gas. And I believe that is not this slide. It's on a special consideration slide that deals with ag.
Sorry, without a page number, I have to look through all the slides to figure out.
I'm sorry.
No, I apologize for that. Can you tell me what was the top letter or the things that it said? And then I can look through it.
Special considerations. It is number 11.
It's 11.
Oh, I was so close. Here we go.
Yeah, it's number 11. And I'm just wondering if revising this, so talking about in a general way, produced water reuse, treated produced water use outside of oil and gas industry, you know, in the face of climate change and the need to reduce the use of fresh water, which is in 1242, we can make general statements, but we'll deal with the specifics later, right? So that's just a suggestion.
Okay, thanks, Barbara. Mike? Mike?
Yeah, thank you. I was probably getting unmuted. Mike Freeman. I wanted to follow up on a couple of comments. Could you go to slide 6, please? And so this goes back to, and I didn't hear in what you discussed, Hope, but I'm hoping we can, in the first bullet here, find a better term than streamline regulation in the first bullet. And then in the second bullet, find some alternative language to reduce duplication for all the reasons I mentioned before. And then if you go to slide 8, sort of the same point here. If we could find some alternative language to reduce or eliminate redundancies and I think those are I'm not disagreeing with the substance of this, but I do think in terms of how we're presenting this to the public, that language, I think, hints at directions that I'm not sure we necessarily want to go to. And I think other terms like refine regulation instead of streamline, or there's ways to wordsmith it, but I think it would be worth doing it to avoid talking about those kind of code words.
Okay, Mike, I'm gonna have you work with Hope offline on those. I didn't hear anyone have any heartburn about those, and so.
Yeah, that's fine. Hope, just let me know. We can talk it through offline.
Okay, Rick?
Yeah, Commissioner, thank you. And Hope, I apologize, I don't know the slide number, but it was the first one we reviewed in this session to where is that the one where we added treated produced water instead of produced water?
Yes. Okay.
I put a comment in chat when we went past that, but I made the mistake of making it a direct message to Barbara instead of to the panelist and the director. The thing I said there is one issue here is that there is not an existing definition of treated produced water amongst other states or with the US EPA with regards to how we're considering it, meaning we're going to remove the suspended solids and the organics out of it, but other than that, it's really not going to change. So in other states, produced water that is currently being treated for reuse in oil and gas operations is considered no different than regular produced water. So what I would do is just suggest here, so we don't send Hope and her crew down a rabbit hole and can find no answers regarding treated produced water, is just change that to say classification of produced water and or treated produced water. Because you're going to find a lot of common ground amongst the definition and rulemaking regarding in storage and treatment or use of produced water, but you're going to have a hard time finding anything amongst the states and the feds regarding treated produced water.
Okay, good point. We'll add that.
I posted Rick's comment to me, to everybody in the chat.
Okay. Okay, understanding we still have a lot to accomplish today, and I think a lot of folks may be needing to take a bathroom break. I'm going to ask one question here. So I think we've gone through a lot of information here. Hope's kind of highlighted the different things that she'll be working on as far as, refining this to the final draft that would be ultimately distributed to all the consortium members prior to the May 1st submittal. My question to the consortium members, do you feel like your voice has been captured in this? Does anyone have any concerns? Are folks comfortable with moving forward with the concept of incorporating the refinements that we talked about here today? But are we missing anything, or does anyone feel like their voice has not been captured? So I am seeing no hands of anyone that seems to feel like their voice has not been captured. And so understanding that, I'm taking that as an acknowledgement that we're good to move forward on this particular topic. So thank you everyone for all the work on that. Really thoughtful discussion. Appreciate everyone's willingness to engage on the topic, and really appreciate all the work that Hope and Kat and Aaron and everyone has done to develop this. And so with that, it's 10:53. Let's take a break till 11 o'clock, and then we'll dive into the next topic on the agenda.
Hey, Hope.
Yes.
Chris IM'd me. He wanted to know if we're still on track on as far as timing for him to get on the meeting for the presentation.
Let me get to the agenda.
Oh, he was supposed to be on at 10:45.
We can go straight to him next if he's got time constraints, since he's a guest. Okay. So we are back from break. We're starting the second session of the Colorado Produced Water Consortium, April 5th, 2024. We have the opportunity to have Chris Korten, Dr. Korten here from the Center for Computational Toxicology and Exposure at the EPA, He's going to give us a presentation on methods to identify hazards in produced water. Appreciate his willingness to come present to us today. I think what we're gonna do is have Chris do his presentation. We're then gonna jump back to a quick conversation about deliverable 3 and some direction to Director Dalton. We'll then go to Karis to give us a presentation on geology and hydrology of the Piceance. Then we're gonna go to Cat Campbell to give us a presentation on geologic history of Colorado. And then if time allows, we'll hit our last item, which is highlights from past presentations. And so with that, I am going to hand this to you, Dr. Korten. I appreciate you being here today to present to the consortium. Well, I saw him there for a second, but did we lose him?
Just a moment, let me check on that. Yeah, I think we might have lost him. Let me see if he pops back up in attendees.
There he is, he's in attendees.
There he is, okay. All right, Chris, we've promoted you to panelist. Just accept that, please, and I'll just do it twice just in case. Okay, looks like he's over in the panelist area.
Yeah, I've gotten kicked off a number of times. Maybe you should go ahead and operate the slides.
Got it. Give me just one moment to make that transition, and then
Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on.
No worries at all. It totally happens sometimes. Let's see. Present. Okay. And send here. Alrighty, I'm hoping you can see the presentation screen, and give me just one more minute or a few seconds to find the controls.
Well, again, I apologize you were getting kicked off, Dr. Korten. I had given you an introduction. We appreciate you being here today and are looking forward to your presentation. So start whenever you're ready.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I get kicked off again, Trish said that she will go ahead and give my talk.
Sounds good, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind. I guess I thought I had a little bit more time. I'm going to keep it very high level, and I'm going to assume that everybody's got some college level biology and chemistry. I know maybe, and hopefully that kind of hits the middle of kind of where your expertise is. But if you do have any questions about anything that I talk about, you can always reach out to me, and I can go ahead and address those questions. So I do work for the EPA, and these are my views and do not reflect US EPA policy or product endorsement. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few definitions which are going to help you to understand some of these techniques that are used to assess the potential hazards that exposure to chemicals or chemical mixtures cause. And the first is called the central dogma. Okay, and this is a concept that permeates pretty much all of biology, and is the flow of information that goes from DNA to RNA to protein. And I'll be focusing a lot on the transcription from the DNA to the RNA, and that we measure RNA as a way to understand how the cells are responding to the exposure to chemical mixtures. And that by interpreting the pattern of the gene expression then can help us to understand what the potential hazards are. Next slide. The next concept is high throughput testing. And this is something that the EPA does a lot of, that we will test thousands of chemicals in one assay at a time, sometimes actually multiple assays. So we get a lot of information from a whole suite of, I think, up to 800 different assays that we've run in the past. Next slide. And so what we've evolved to at the EPA is, or moving past this single assay testing to now combine looking at gene transcription and high throughput testing. And now we call it high throughput transcript profiling. So here in one assay, we can look at the expression of thousands of genes at once. And normally, what I'm talking about here is looking at the whole human genome at one time. And the platform that we use looks at about 22,000 different genes. Next slide. But I'll also talk about another way of looking at gene expression. That is one gene at a time, and that's by qPCR. Okay, next slide, please. So the next definition is biological pathways. So we all know about individual genes and that they're regulated a number of different ways, but usually genes are coordinately regulated and they serve different functions in the cell. And these genes can be grouped into biological pathways. So when I say pathways, usually it means that these are genes that have a similar biological function or location in the cell. And that by looking at the pathway level can help us to understand the mechanism of the cellular or tissue effects, whether they're adverse or not. Next slide. Now, what we do at the EPA to identify doses of chemicals that are safe, we do benchmark dose modeling, either with toxicity endpoints or with gene expression more recently. And so in this curve here, you can see it, we start at high doses, and then as we get to lower doses, we have a less of a response. And then we get to some place on the dose response profile where we don't really see any effects at all. And so we call those benchmark dose levels. And we can define with some confidence limit the dose at which we think that it's safe. And I'm not going to go into kind of what a reference dose is and how we go ahead and derive all this, just to know that we can use gene expression in dose response or concentration response and find doses or concentrations which are potentially safe. Next. Probably don't need to show this. You guys know this better than I do, but obviously just to remind us that produced water is a complex mixture, includes a variety of chemicals, daughter products, transformation byproducts. And certainly we're interested in the potential toxicity of this complex mixture. Okay, next. So we have a number of approaches at the EPA to identify chemicals and evaluate hazards in complex mixtures. And there's a lot of mixtures research that's going on. I'm not going to have time to talk about much, but I will talk about briefly how we're using mass spec to do targeted, non-targeted chemical analysis. And next. And we're also using that high throughput transcript profiling in human cell lines treated with chemicals or with mixtures. And these two approaches allow us to cast a very wide net. So we capture all of the effects or potentially all of the effects, either in the cells that are treated or the chemicals that are in the mixture. Next. And then also be mentioning very briefly how we go about doing analysis in a number of rodent models, and those are kind of more traditional methods. Next. So I have a couple of slides from Mark Strider, who's our resident expert and does all of our mass spec. And the way he couches the mass spec approach is that if you want to know more about the potential hazards, you got to know what you're exposed to, like what's in the different media that you're looking at. So next, so you start with the foundation, you identify a chemical next, and then you have a house on top of that, which allows you to determine the occurrence, the potential risk, and then how to remediate. Next. And so to do that, we use high resolution mass spec. Go ahead. And see, one more time. So there are two ways of doing this. One is a low resolution mass spec to answer questions like, well, how much PFOA is in my water, right? So you're doing a targeted analysis and trying to determine if that particular chemical is in your sample. And then we use high resolution mass spec to do what's called non-targeted analysis. And this is where we really have no preconceived notion of what's in it. Okay, press it 2 more times, please. And we can do this 2 ways. One is a suspect screening, where we compare the profiles to what we think might be in it. So for instance, if we're potentially looking at produced water and we know that there are certain chemicals that are in the produced water based on the literature, we can compare the profiles to those chemicals. Or we can go ahead and just do this using a non-targeted analysis and look for and determine anything that's in the mixture. Okay, last slide here. Okay, and then one more time. So this is just to remind me to tell you that, yeah, we do have a fairly sophisticated workflows for doing non-targeted analysis, including a number of computational tools to try to tease out what these different analytes are. And so next slide. So the question is really what chemicals in our sample are important. Okay, next slide. And I'm sorry, this is not, maybe all this animation was not a good idea. Okay, next. Okay, so let me focus on an example on this high throughput testing, especially one I think that you would find of most interest. Okay, next slide. And I take this from a paper that was published in 2019. This was a collaboration between the EPA and the USGS, where they were looking at the potential toxicity in surface waters across the United States. And they're using an assay called the Adagene assay. And this is a in vitro cell-based assay. You expose the cells, and then you have a reported set of reporters that will allow you to understand the effect of those chemicals on a large variety of different important transcription factors, which control the expression of genes. Next slide. And we don't need to go into like all of these different transcription factors which are listed here, but it is relevant here that they've got, maybe up to 70 different assays that they can run simultaneously. So you expose the cells, there's a readout, and then you can use computational approaches to see, well, which one of these is activated. And so next. And so in this example, which is this water from the South Platte River, actually pretty close to probably where some of you guys are based, they found that there were components in the water that activated the estrogen receptor, next, and also activated the dioxin receptor. And so just taking this one view, you can look at get lots of information just from one assay and one sample. Next. So then they looked across all of these samples and they ranked them based on how many of these factors were perturbed by the components in the water. So blue means there's really not much going on. Red means there's a lot going on. And unfortunately for you guys, there's a lot of things going on, you know, in the South Platte River, and then also it looks like, you know, maybe a little bit south of Kansas City. So the point is that you can take these high throughput assays and you can compare contamination across sites. And then you can also get ideas about what is being perturbed, what biological factors are being perturbed. And because we know linkages between those factors and different adverse effects, we can then extrapolate to determine what different hazards might exist when people or animals are exposed to the water. Next. And next. Okay, so here I'm going to go a little bit into what's called the high throughput transcript profiling, which our center uses quite a bit now in evaluating chemical hazards. Next. And why don't you push it one more time, actually two more times. Okay, so this shows the methods that are used to go from basically cells to some output. And the output here on the far right is looking at the gene expression of the whole human transcriptome. And in between, it's basically you use cells, we have automated ways of plating the cells out, of also dispensing the chemicals or the mixtures, and then we expose the cells for different lengths of time. And then we crack open the cells and then send the lysates off to a company called BioSpider, and they do the analysis for us. And then they send us back the raw output, which we analyze. Next. I'm not going to go through all this, but basically we take that raw data that comes from BioSpider, go through a number of procedures, and in the bottom right, what we can get out of this raw data is we can look at this coordinated changes in gene expression, especially genes that are grouped into pathways. And then we can also determine the what are called the molecular points of departure. In other words, the lowest concentration where there are no effects. Next. And this just shows an example of one chemical, lovastatin, and over here on the left, where you're looking at a set of genes that are in a pathway called hallmark cholesterol homeostasis. And you can see that this green bar, which represents the benchmark concentration for the activation of this pathway. And so this is just one pathway that's activated by lovastatin, and over on the right you see many different pathways that are activated. And there are a number of different ways to rank the signatures and also rank the chemicals based on their potency. Next. Okay, and then let me just show you kind of a real world example of this, where my colleague Josh Harrell and his group collaborated with a number of other groups to analyze the potential effects on by HTTR of waters that were collected in a number of locations shown here, and one site in Australia, 3 in the United States. And they looked at treated wastewater and reclaimed water, as well as surface water and drinking water. And what they did was they took extracts, exposed a human cell line, and then did that HTTR, looking at the whole human genome. And this graph here on the bottom right just indicates the number of genes. And I think what you'll see in, well, I can't show it here. Next slide, please. So this is sort of part of the output that you might see from the HTTR. And along the bottom here are the names of all the genes that they're looking at. And what they've done is they've grouped these genes and their expression based on whether it's dark blue is wastewater, light blue is the reclaimed water. So we'll just focus on that now. And what you can see is that for the dark blue, for all 4 of the sites, you're seeing a lot of, activity, whether the genes are going up or the genes are going down. But then when you go to the light blue panels right below it, you see that most of that color goes away, meaning that those genes are no longer active. So what it means is that these treatments are having an effect on the genes, and so they're no longer regulated. And next slide. Now you can take this to and look at the pathway level too, and put this into the context of exposure in the cell. So the 1 mark on the upper 4 and lower 4 panels here, the 1 actually means the undiluted water, whereas you've got up to 100-fold concentration that you're looking at. So what they're doing is they're taking different dilutions of the water and exposing the cells, doing the HTTR, doing the pathway analysis. And for this discussion, if we could just focus on the dark blue and the light blue, you can see that across the genes along the top, the dark blue is on the far left of each of the panels compared to the light blue, meaning that at lower concentrations, you're activating a lot of genes. Similarly, if you look at the panels on the bottom, that there are a lot of pathways that are being activated by the wastewater, but not the treated water. And so this way you can get an idea of the concentration or dilution of the wastewater or the different waters that have no effects and maybe are potentially safe to be exposed to, and as well as to identify potential hazards in all of these pathways that are being analyzed. Next. And then here's an example of where we're using qPCR, and I'm pretty sure that you had a presentation from James Rosenblum from Colorado School of Mines who went through this. We were part of this study where we took his water and then looked at the activation of a couple of different things. And this was to see how effective his treatment train was in purifying high salinity Permian Basin raw produced water. Next. And just to introduce the dioxin receptor, this is a receptor that's been around for a long time. It was discovered many decades ago, and I'm not going to go through exactly how it's activated and how it regulates gene expression, but for this discussion, it's useful to know that when you have sustained activation and long-term activation of this receptor, bad things happen, and I'll go through that in a second. It's also good to know that it regulates a number of genes, including these CYP genes. So CYP1A1 and CYP1B1 are 2 of the targets. And if those genes are upregulated, then people usually assume that it is the activation of this aryl hydrocarbon receptor. Next. So, like I said, if you have sustained activation of the dioxin receptor, bad things happen. And here are the list of all the bad things that can happen. And it's also known that activation of the receptor, especially by TCDD, will lead to tumors in multiple sites in mice and rats. It's also known as a human carcinogen. Okay, next slide. And this just shows that, yeah, I'm going to focus on the qPCR. Hit it 2 more times. Okay, so here is on the upper left is the treatment train, and just shows how dirty the water is to start with and how clean the water looks when you get done with it. I'm not going to go through the separate processes, but here what we did is we took the water that James gave us from these different treatment steps, exposed this MCF7 cell line to the diluted water. And then we looked at the expression of a number of genes after 6 hours. So these are all genes that are regulated by the dioxin receptor. So you can see you're starting with the raw water on the left, and you end up with the distillate on the right. Next slide. It just shows that, that these different steps are very effective at removing compounds that activate the dioxin receptor. Next. Now we have one more trick that we can use here just to confirm that those changes in gene expression are regulated by the dioxin receptor. So we can compare effects in what we call wild type cells that have a normal complement of genes, and then the cells in the same background that lack one gene, that is the dioxin receptor. So if you see that you get an effect in the wild type cells, but not the AHR knockout cells or null cells, then that is pretty good evidence that the dioxin receptor is involved. And sure enough, when we did these experiments, you can see again that you're looking at a decrease across these different treatments of a dioxin receptor target, the CYP1A1, and then you no longer see any effects in any of these treatments in the AHR knockouts. Next. Okay, the last thing I'll talk about is what we call the ETAP, which is the EPA transcriptomic assessment product. Next, and this has been proposed to help EPA to deal with the large number of chemicals there is really no information on. Next, and one more time. So I'm going to be dealing with high throughput transcriptomics, but in vivo situation here. Again, applying benchmark dose modeling, looking not on toxicity endpoints, which are the traditional endpoints, but on gene expression. Next. And the reason why we're probably going to rely more on this ETAP is that very few chemicals actually have been run through traditional toxicity tests. And I've highlighted the components that are in produced water, and overall, less than 30% have been run through traditional toxicity tests. Next. And actually even worse, that less than 15% of the chemicals in produced water have any kind of human health assessments. So that's why we're relying on this ETAP for chemicals that we are thinking have a high priority for human exposure. Next. Okay. And the other reason is that it takes a long time to do a human health assessment. And usually it takes 6 to 14 years and lots of animals. And there's significant data now to indicate that this can be replaced with a transcriptomic assay, which can give you comparable benchmark dose values compared to endpoints that you would derive in a mouse or a rat. Next. And so the procedures are you treat male and female rats for 5 days with different doses of a chemical or a mixture. You collect the tissues, you isolate the RNA, you measure the transcript profile, and then you do that BMD analysis on the genes and the pathways. And you look across all the different tissues, and then you identify the lowest pathway benchmark dose from any of the tissues. And then we can use that as a way to derive a reference dose, which we could say would be safe for humans to be exposed to. So this process could be applied to complex mixtures to identify dilutions that would be safe and pathways linked to toxicity. And then I got a summary slide. So I've told you very briefly, and sorry about how fast I had to go, but talk to you about these different methods that are now being used by the EPA to characterize complex mixtures. And so I've gone through briefly targeted, non-targeted mass spec, And that's used to identify the chemicals and relative abundance in a mixture. Talk to you about high throughput assays, giving you an example of the Adagene assay. And that allows you to identify different factors that are activated that then can be linked to adverse effects. And then I think what's emerging and EPA is going to rely more and more on is this high throughput transcript profiling, whether it's done in vitro or it's done in vivo. And that allows you to identify genes and pathways that are altered that can be linked to cellular and tissue effects that are part of hazard evaluations. It can also be used to derive benchmark concentrations or benchmark doses to identify exposure levels that could be considered safe. All right, and that's it. So I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Korten. A lot of information there. Really appreciate you being here today. I open the floor to consortium members. Does anyone have questions for Dr. Korten? James?
Yeah. Hey, Chris, good to see you. Great presentation. I did have just, could you elaborate on the ETAP? I hadn't heard that before, and just how you go about this. So you expose a rat or mouse for 5 days, and then essentially you're dissecting the animal and then extracting from there.
Yeah, so this shows pretty much the process. So we're focusing on rats, and back up. So the concept is that we want to see identify the transcriptional changes which are most sensitive to the chemical. At this point, it's mostly chemicals that have been run here, and they focus first on a lot of these uncharacterized PFAS compounds. And so they've run different doses of the PFAS through the rats, and they isolate the RNA from a whole suite of tissues from both sexes. And then we use a number of computational procedures to identify the benchmark doses. And that can, and you line them all up and you look at and identify the most sensitive benchmark doses, which are used to then derive the reference value. So what I didn't spend a lot of time on, and I mentioned it, is that this is based on the concept that if you're seeing transcriptional effects at a particular dose, then that dose is probably going to lead to adverse effects if the dose is high enough, right? And so what they found is that when you line up the benchmark doses for the transcript profiling and then the benchmark doses that are used in the risk assessment, that they line up pretty well. And now the transcript profiling might be protective, but not that protective. But it is protective. And so it allows you to generate a reference dose quickly. It's a little expensive, but you can do it within 6 to 9 months versus a risk assessment, normal risk assessment that takes 10 years, because there's a lot of chemicals we're exposed to where you don't know anything, how safe they are,
Chris,
or dangerous they are.
Kind of one other question then would be, it seems if you're for individual chemicals or trying to do that rapidly, like you said PFAS, but for mixtures like produced water or other mixtures, is this kind of then you're just more or less extrapolating for the mixture and relating that back to something? And
yeah, for mixtures, this is something that we've been talking about, and that obviously it's a bit hard to interpret because it is a complex mixture, but you're looking at the whole mixture. You can still derive a benchmark dose or really a benchmark dilution, right? How dilute can the mixture be before you stop seeing anything, right? But you can still apply kind of the pathway analysis to see what is being perturbed and whether that is even human relevant or not. So there's a lot of opportunities there in applying this to mixtures.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that.
Barbara?
Yeah, I'll defer to Chloe and go after her. Thank you.
Chloe?
Thanks. Thanks for the presentation. And this might be sort of what you guys were just touching on. I was just thinking about, if we know, if we see upregulation of things like the dioxin receptors to things that are not dioxin, how confident, do we know about the adverse outcome at that point? So I think you alluded to this with, the different molecular initiating pathways and adverse outcome pathways, but how where's that step in all of this? And how do we get closer to it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. So obviously identification of the activation of the dioxin receptor is just sort of the first step. And that you need to put this into the context of the level of activation, and then also to start building a database of hazard endpoints that can help you to understand the significance of that activation. So for instance, there are downstream effects that you might also want to measure. Because, for instance, in the work that we did with James, we saw activation of the dioxin receptor from the components in the produced water. But is that it's a concern, but we have to put that into the context of exposure to humans or animals, and also the level of activation. Because normally when you're thinking about association of the activation of the receptor and adverse endpoints, usually the receptor has to be activated quite at a high level to be able to see those downstream effects. So it's just one step in the process, and there are different ways to kind of put all the data together to see if it's a problem or not. The other is we can compare the activation of that receptor by the components in the produced water to some reference chemical like TCDD, or maybe one of the polychlorobiphenyls, which also activate the dioxin receptor.
But in general, you can say if they're not turned on, it's probably good. And if they're turned on really strongly, that's probably bad.
Well, yeah, but I think you can drill down on that a bit to get an idea compared to other chemicals or other exposure situations, whether that's or how much of a concern that is.
Thank you.
Barbara?
Yeah, I have several questions, but first, sorry, this is Barbara Vasquez. I want to thank you for your presentation. This is really, really interesting. I'm delighted that EPA was willing to bring this forward. I have a question about in vitro versus in vivo. So in vivo clearly is in rats, and humans aren't rats, although they've been the study animal for decades. Is the in vitro work done with human cell lines?
Yes.
And would you consider
But,
that?
there are multiple examples of working with cells from mice, rats, zebrafish, etc. Yeah. So I probably can guess where you're going, but go ahead.
No, it's not to be critical. I'm just asking the question in terms of the relevance. I've been involved in animal studies as well, not as the animal, but as the scientist. But my follow-up question for you is on produced water as a complex mixture. If you get a signal, is it possible to go back and do some chromatography or separation techniques to be able to then nail down what component or components in combination are creating that reaction?
Well, I think we have that opportunity, and I wouldn't be surprised if people are doing that. Yeah, and that's called effects-based analysis, right? Where you do a fractionation of a complex mixture, and then you see if you still see the effect, and that way it narrows down to, you can narrow down which components in the mixture are causing the effect. It's tedious, and but it can be done.
Tedious for sure. And one last question that you probably can't answer, but a thought for all of us is, what do these kinds of analytical techniques cost if Colorado was interested in having some more done, like James has had done with you? Is it something that the state could afford?
Well, if you're talking about the high throughput transcriptomics, it's, the prices come down quite a bit from the usual way of performing whole transcriptome analysis like RNA-seq or microarrays. So, it can range anywhere from, depending on how many samples you have, but that you give to BioSpider, it can go from $50 up to $300 per sample.
Thanks so much.
Rick? You're muted.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Dr. Corcoran, thank you very much. This was a very informative and well put together presentation. As somebody who presents regularly myself, I appreciate the effort that you put in to this presentation. One of my questions has already been answered earlier, but with regards to the toxicological information available for produced water, in a couple of your slides, you were showing that of the compounds that are in a typical produced water, we only have information regarding roughly 10 to 20% of the compounds. It was very low. So my question to you is, and it's somewhat hypothetical, when you take a look, for example, at the water you looked at for Dr. Rosenblum, and I'm just throwing a number out here, so just for an example, when we look at produced water, let's say it has 200 different compounds in it. But by the time that produced water went through James's treatment process, so pre-treatment, a distillation process, and then some polishing step on the downside, let's suppose it got down to 20 different constituents that were left in that water. Is it possible now to look at those 20 and say, well, we have 50% of those compounds we do have toxicological information on? Are we improving the knowledge about the water when we remove 90% of the constituents that may be in it?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one. Not knowing what the chemicals are, so you wouldn't necessarily assume that the chemicals that are left over after all the purification steps are the ones that we know about. They might actually be the ones that we don't know about, but and you won't know that until you do some analytical analysis to drill down to find out what they are. You may end up with the same proportion of chemicals as you don't know much about, unfortunately. But James's system, that certainly has utility and addresses that in a way that affects directed analysis, because instead of doing fractionation, you're doing purification, but in effect, you're separating out the components in the produced water and have an opportunity to see, well, what are those different components or mixtures of components doing? So not very satisfying. I know the problem is that, again, we from what I've understood, that we don't know really half of what all the components are in produced waters and how consistent they are across different oil fields, and then there's the components that go down the well, and then how are they transformed, etc. It's just a complex problem that I think can be best managed by taking some of these approaches that look at everything as opposed to just drilling down on what you want to look at.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Well, thanks again, Dr. Corton, for being here, giving us a presentation and answering our questions. Certainly appreciate that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Consortium members, I think we're going to jump straight into the recommendations or direction given to Director Dalton for deliverable 3, and then we'll maybe take a 5-minute break.
Thank you.
And then be able to. Hey, Nikki, you're unmuted. And then be able to jump into the CARES presentation and then see where we're at that point. So.
Office. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Hannah, can you mute Nikki? I think she stepped away.
Oh, I got it.
All right. So Hope, do you want to kind of guide us in direction for deliverable 3?
Thank you, Chair Messner. For the panel, for the people on the call, the consortium members, I've placed deliverable 3's language in the chat, and Hannah will place that in the chat for the public. I'm going to read it, and then I'll tell you the approach that I'd like to take. So for deliverable 3, by July 1st, 2024, based on data reported under section 346134, the consortium will analyze and report on current produced water infrastructure, storage, and treatment facilities within the different oil and gas production basins in the state, with specific emphasis on the Denver-Julesburg or DJ oil and gas production basin. So I'll be asking you for direction today. At our May meeting, we'll present a first draft. At our June meeting, we'll finalize that product and make sure that we captured all voices. I do want to remind everyone, I'm affectionately calling this the current produced water infrastructure deliverable 5, which is due August 1st, is the availability. Deliverable 5 is due September 1st, and it's the future produced water needs for infrastructure. So for this deliverable 3, which is the current state, I'd like to approach this. We will have a report similar to deliverable 1 and deliverable 2. I'm going to begin with defining what is produced water infrastructure, storage, and treatment facilities. What do we mean by that? I'd like to define the different oil and gas production basins. I want to include why we chose to emphasize the DJ Basin. Next, I want to identify the available data, and I've been working with a consortium member, John Heil, who works at the ECMC, and the ECMC staff, Kat Campbell, Judy Sclafani, and Arthur Kopsel. We've currently identified forms 15, 26, 28, and 44 as having relevant data for this deliverable. So we'll start there. I'd like to explain the origin of the data, how often it's updated, and any limitations to the data. I'd also like to include a map of publicly available data. So when you go on the ECMC website, there's a significant amount of publicly available data related to this deliverable. And then I'd like to include flow line data, but because flow line data is considered critical infrastructure with security needs, I'd like to mask that data on the map and maybe use a heat map kind of format, highlighting where there may be counties that have this infrastructure and counties that don't. So that's my approach. I am open for any feedback. Chair Messner.
Thanks, Hope. Anybody have thoughts or questions about the process that Hope has laid out, or the thoughts there? Tessa?
Yeah, it's hard to follow all that, actually. Is there a written kind of outline of what you just suggested, that I missed or that will be sent?
There's not a written outline yet, and
I can't say I
apologize
followed
for that.
all of that, spoken out like that. So, that's just, I'm not sure I can give good comments, or necessarily all of our members can, just because it's a lot of content to try and absorb and think about.
Thank you for the feedback.
Any other thoughts on that? Understanding that we're just giving initial guidance here, and through the initial guidance of how we're going to approach it, then the actual details will come out in the initial draft. Irene?
Irene Andrus, thank you. Are you also going to be identifying gaps?
So I'm not sure if I'll be identifying any gaps. I don't plan to at this point. I will take direction from the consortium members because deliverable 5 is related to future infrastructure needs. I'm hoping maybe to defer that to deliverable 5, but for this deliverable 3, I'm focusing to kind of summarize, I'm focusing on working with ECMC and ECMC's existing data. And so to Tessa's point, if there is any other data beyond ECMC's data, I would like direction from the consortium on contacting those resources.
So this is basically an as-is map then?
Yes, so kind of like the baseline, this is what we know today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and do remember that the two deliverables build upon each other. So this is current state. This is what we have for recommendation. The next step would be recommendations for necessary infrastructure in order to increase reuse and recycling. Barbara?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why the sole focus on the DJ Basin, in that most of the produced water treatment and reuse is done on the west slope. And if we're going to create a map, it would be very informative for all of us to see what's going on there, particularly since it provides an opportunity benchmark, if you will, for what might happen in the DJ Basin if infrastructure were to be built out, or we were able to build it out. So my question.
I mean, my thought is, and Hope certainly jump in, the legislation asks us to emphasize the DJ in this particular deliverable. And so I think we have to listen to that. I think if the consortium wants to expand kind of the analysis to be broader, then I think that's certainly something that can be contemplated as well.
Well, I'm just thinking that the West Slope is our example of how it might be done. So
Sure.
Having that included in the analysis will provide a potential pathway.
I think that's a fair observation. Jeff, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I would just echo that to Barbara's comments from a Piceance perspective. Absolutely, I think to be a part of that and to provide that information and be able to tell the good stories that we have out in the Piceance is important in that. And I think to Irene's comment earlier, the goal here, I think, in the deliverable 5 is really to benchmark against what we are currently doing and if it makes sense within these communities. But I also want to recognize, and we've brought this up multiple times, that there are lots of differences between basins. And so I think that's the other goal here is let's start really with what is the current status quo of what we're trying to solve for down the line, but to get a good understanding of what's possible.
Sure. Hope?
Jeff, just a question on that. If we didn't emphasize the DJ and we looked at each basin of equal importance, what are the basins? Right now, we have representatives from the Piceance, the DJ, San Juan, and Raton. Do those four, like focusing on those four, will that satisfy what you're looking for?
From my perspective, the approach that you're taking in seeking information from ECMC with respect to how operators permit these locations currently and the forms that are accompanying that those facilities, I think will allow sort of a statewide look at what's available across all basins. So I think that's the framework and the paradigm to really be sort of holistic in what we're trying to accomplish here. My sense is that the infrastructure is going to look very different on the west slope than it does on the Front Range for multiple reasons, i.e. just the history of how operators like Terra and Caris have utilized produced water in their oil and gas operations for 20 plus years. So, but I think your approach, looking at these specific forms 28, Form 15, Form 26, I think I would also include the under the 1100 series rules is a requirement to register produced water systems, and I think that's probably another good information source that's already publicly out there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff.
Eric?
I can help out on anything on that too if you need.
Yes, thank you, Eric England. And also adding to what Jeff mentioned, the 905 rule-related facilities, E&P waste facilities, will probably also be helpful in the informing what equipment or locations are already out there. And I agree and support your approach using what has been registered and is being reported and tested. I do believe that the extensive work that's been done by the agency as well as operators should give you a very good picture of the available of the resources there. I also appreciate your comments regarding the sensitivity of critical infrastructure. And so, thank you for the consideration of that in regards to how that information would be presented. And I also wanted to comment and reflect that another upcoming deliverable, I think it's in August, will be the actual produced water volumes information, what is out there and available by basin. And I think that will help to be informative of the amount of infrastructure and the types of infrastructure in each basin is directly correlated to the volumes that are available in those basins. Thank you.
Good points. Barbara?
Thank you very much, Chair Messner, for allowing me to ask one or make one more comment. And that is one of the reasons I think it's really important to maintain a statewide focus is not only for that potential benchmark, but also as we move forward in our deliverables and we think about the actual volume of water used, not only are we thinking about oil and gas basins, we're thinking about river basins, and in particular the Colorado River, given all the focus on water use out of that basin. And we may get to the point where we're looking at the actual amount of water withdrawn from the flow into particular river basins used by oil and gas, as opposed to in line of reducing the volume of fresh water used for completions. So thank you for that.
Good points. Any other thoughts on that? Hope, do you feel like you have adequate direction?
I believe I do, and we'll be working on this in the next 2 weeks. And then I guess we actually have a little bit longer before our next meeting, but you should see a draft by April 26th or 29th.
Great. Well, thanks for the input on that. And appreciate the conversation around expanding it to include all the basins. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So thanks for bringing that up. So I have been informed that the next two presentations actually build upon each other. And so understanding it's noon right now, I do want to give folks a chance to step away just for a second. So I wonder if we could come back at 12:07. And then between Kat Campbell and the folks from Caris, you're going to have about 50 minutes to do both presentations with questions and answers. And I think we can maybe accomplish that. But I just wanted, understanding that these two presentations build upon each other, I want to kind of set the stage for timing on those two so that we can conclude the meeting today at 1 o'clock and respect folks' time. So we'll meet back here at 12:07. And then we can start with Kat Campbell's presentation.
Board.
So this is Colorado Produced Water Consortium, April 5th, 2024 meeting. We're reconvening after a short break. Appreciate most of our consortium members hanging in there. I know it's been a long day, a lot of information. Really appreciate the discussions that we've had, both for deliverable 2 and deliverable 3, and looking forward to these upcoming presentations from both Kat Campbell, who's the science advisor for data innovation at ECMC, who's going to give us a presentation on geologic history of Colorado. And then we're going to hear from Nathan Kumela and Christine Myaspansky, both from Caris Oil and Gas, on geology and hydrology in the Piceance Basin. So with that, I will hand it over to Kat Campbell to give us the initial presentation. Is Kat with us? Have we elevated Kat?
I am, yes.
There you are, okay.
I am not able to share my screen. I have host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, just a moment. I thought I might have to make you co-host. I just wasn't sure.
Thank you, Hannah.
And you should get that in just a moment.
Okay.
You should have gotten that by now. And Christine, I'm going ahead and making you a co-host as well so that we can have an easy transition.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. All right, do you guys see the presentation?
We do.
Great, that's always good news. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity. Over the next few meetings, geologists from the state, USGS and operators will be providing some background on the geology of Colorado that pertains to the work of the consortium. We'll cover the geology of the state in basin, by formation, how oil and gas form, and we'll go through each of the major basins in the state in detail to provide insight into the unique geologic conditions of each oil and gas producing area and the water that comes out of those areas. So starting today, we're going to go through geologic history of Colorado and how basins form. And then Caris will go after this and they will talk about specifically the Piceance Basin. So starting, this is what's called an exaggerated relief map of the state of Colorado. And basically what that means is that the mountains are bigger and the plains look flatter. So it's just showing the mountains in a little bit more relief than you actually see, and the plains look flatter than they actually are. Here are the some major metropolitan areas, just to orient yourselves as to where we are on the map. And then adding in the location of the sedimentary basins in Colorado. A basin is a large-scale depression in the Earth's crust where thick sequences of sediments have accumulated over geologic time. The scale of this time can range from tens of millions to hundreds of millions of years to get enough sediment to fill these depressions in the Earth. And the way this filling happens is primarily through gravity-driven transport of waterborne eroded material. And basically what that means is you have mountains eroding And that material that comes off the mountains fills in the basins. So you think about the Continental Divide that splits Colorado, water that comes off one side goes to the Mississippi River, and then coming off the other side, you have this separation of the water. That water carries sediment. And as the sediment moves down the channel, it's slowly filling, for example, the Gulf of Mexico. So we have sand from Colorado that's being put into the Gulf of Mexico. It's an amazing process. A basin has no reference to its current topography. So let's take, for example, over here in the Piceance Basin. Let me get a pointer. There we go. Over here in the Piceance Basin, you can see on the exaggerated relief that there's a lot going on. There's a lot of elevation in this area. And below that elevation is a significant basin, thousands and thousands of feet deep, below the surface of the earth. So just because there are mountains on the surface doesn't mean that there's not a basin below it. So it's kind of an interesting concept to think about what you see now versus what's underneath, below your feet, deep inside of the earth. So as this material comes off of mountains and is put into basins, it gets buried deeper and deeper as more and more sediment goes into the basin. And eventually this material reaches very high temperatures and very high pressures, and that results in something called lithification, or the creation of rock. And what's below us is solid rock. It's just amazing how these processes work. So now adding in the labels for the basins, we have the Denver Basin, which there's been a fair amount of discussion on already. This is sometimes called the Denver-Julesburg Basin, the Denver Basin. They're all the same thing. It's all the Denver Basin, and this extends up into Wyoming. Next, we have the Laramie Basin, shown here. This also extends up into Wyoming. We have the North and Middle Park Basin, the Sand Wash Basin, the Piceance Basin, and then a little bit of the Uinta Basin, but not enough to highlight on the map. The Paradox Basin over here in the west, the San Juan Basin extending down to New Mexico, the San Luis Valley, the Raton Basin, South Park Basin, Canyon City Embayment, and then the Hugoton Embayment. And the terminology here, an embayment is another way to describe a basin. An embayment is typically a section of a basin that opens into a larger basin. So embayment is still a basin. It's just a different way to describe it. So how do basins form? I'm going to go through a scaled perspective from how the Earth slowly transforms itself to the impacts of this transformation on the state of Colorado, and then scaling down to a basin by basin view, looking at how each basin in Colorado has a unique history that geologists have unraveled. So starting off, the exciting world of plate tectonics. I know you guys are all thrilled. I can see lots of smiles for those who have your cameras on. This image is a standard map that you see of Earth. We have North America here, South America, Africa. You can kind of orient yourself with that. These dark lines represent plate boundaries. And basically, the Earth is covered with a crust. And this crust used to be molten hot, kind of the surface of Venus. Through time, that crust cooled and created this plate, these plates. And the plates broke up and cracked as the Earth continued to cool. And now these plates actually are in motion and interact with each other. There are about 8 major plates now and dozens of smaller plates that are constantly interacting with each other through geologic time. Geologists aren't sure the total number of tectonic plates and how that's varied over time, but we do know that if plates have drifted together and rifted apart, that number has varied from one single supercontinent to the 8 or so that we have now. And this plate movement is actually the surface expression of convection in the Earth's interior. And that's a pretty full concept that we'll look at in detail here. So this is a cross-section or a slice of the Earth. So here we have an ocean, we have North America, and we have Europe over here. If we were to slice the Earth open and look deep inside of it, this is what we would see. So we have the ocean here, and that's part of what's called the lithosphere. This is cold, rigid, and brittle. Below that, about 100 kilometers, we have the asthenosphere. And this is hot, weak, and plastic. This is part of the mantle. And as the mantle moves and heats up and reaches the upper part of the lithosphere, it can actually kind of move in circles. It's an absolutely amazing process. Below that, we have the outer core, at about 2,890 kilometers, and then the inner core. And the entire Earth is just under about 6,400 kilometers in thickness. So you have a significant range in temperature from the inner core up through the brittle part of the lithosphere that we see here. As these different temperature units of the Earth interact with each other, you can have cooler, denser material from the lithosphere that sinks down into the mantle. And that's thought to be the primary driver of this circulation, while hotter, less dense material, such as what we see here with this plume coming up, provides an upwelling, and that's a secondary driver of these plates moving around. The forces generated from these vertical movements result in horizontal shifts of these tectonic plates. So in this case, we have a plume coming up between Europe and North America, and that's actually causing thinning of the lithosphere, and you have mantle material that's coming up and pushing those plates apart. So North America is moving away from the European plate. It's incredible. And this happens at a scale of about millimeters to centimeters a year. And this is called a divergent margin because the plates are diverging from each other. As those plates interact with each other, the lithospheric material can be recycled. So this is a really interesting map that shows the age of the continental crust. Archean is really, really old, talking billions of years old, and that's shown in orange. So you can see here in the northern part of the US, you have some of that Archean material. Australia is where that material is best known and studied by geologists. And the colors go through, until you get to yellow. And this is Mesozoic through Cenozoic. So thinking more, much more modern sediment. So this is the youngest part of the Earth. This image shows some of those processes where you have plates interacting with each other. This is the lithosphere here that's shown in gray. Here's an example of some volcanoes. And then this shows the lithosphere starting to subduct or go underneath a plate. This is called oceanic lithosphere, and it's really heavy and dense. And so when an oceanic plate hits a continental plate, that oceanic plate is going to go underneath the continental plate. It's going to start to melt, and as it melts, you get volcanoes. So this is what's going on with Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, all along Oregon and Washington and California. You actually have these volcanoes forming because this plate is subducting, melting, and creating volcanoes. And then here you have an ocean spreading ridge. So this is what's going on between North America and Europe in Iceland, where you have that thinning of the crust and you have the mantle plumes coming up and actually spreading the oceanic plate. So that's pushing the oceanic plate towards the continental plate, causing it to subduct, and the cycle continues. Now, how does this relate to basin formation? Well, the plate interactions actually express themselves in continental crust as basins. And each basin type tends to be filled with a specific sequence of rocks based on its formation, some of which allows formation of a petroleum province. So here we have several types of basins. We have a foreland basin, a rift basin, intercontinental basin, and a passive margin basin. In the foreland basin, if you think about plates being pushed into each other, they are trying to accommodate all that pressure, and they start to kind of crumble and build on each other and thicken that part of the lithosphere. As a result of that additional weight of those mountains being built, it pushes down the crust and causes a basin to form on the foreland side of that mountain that's being built. That typically fills with water, and as the mountains are eroded, all of that material comes down into the basin and fills up the basin. In a rift basin, you have downward slip-on faults. So in this case, the Earth is being stretched. And so to accommodate that, you have sections of the Earth actually dropping down and creating basins. That's what's going on. This is a picture in Iceland. So over here to the east, we have the North American plate. Over here to the west, we have the Eurasian plate. And this is the Rift Valley. You can see these little slits where, as this grows, this is going to become a huge basin, and it's going to fill with sediment and eventually become a rift basin. An intercontinental basin is a basin that forms in the interior of a continent, possibly over an old rift. In the US, the southern Oklahoma Alocagen in Oklahoma, which forms the Anadarko Basin, is one of the best examples. This is a modern example in the Central European plate. This is a map view where we're looking down, kind of a satellite view onto the North Sea. Here's the UK, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden. And then we're doing that cross-section view again, where we slice the earth open and look inside. Each of these different colors represents a certain rock type. These used to be flat, but as you can see, they're not flat anymore. There are all kinds of crazy features in these rocks, and that's from a rift that formed here, and it's starting to be filled with sediment in the North Sea. The last example is the passive margin basin, and this is where you have thin crust at the edge of an ocean basin. An example of this is the eastern US. So here's a view looking down at the eastern US. If you removed all of the water, this is what the ocean would look like. So here we have New York City, and as we go out into the ocean, it's shallow, and then it gets really, really deep. And this is the base of the ocean here. So this is all sediment, all of this stuff where the ocean's really shallow. This is what used to be the Appalachian Mountains. Those mountains were considered to be the size of the Himalaya, and all that sediment eroded away and created this continental shelf off the eastern coast of the US. So next concept to go over is geologic time. This is the geologic time scale, and it's shown as a pie chart with each section representing the amount of time of each part of Earth's history. So Earth started about 4.5 billion years ago, and then we go up to where we are here. See if I can get this guy to go away. All right, well here, people are barely a blip. People would be about the size of a piece of hair on this scale. So here we have some different color bars, and these represent the stages of life. So about 4 billion years ago, we had the start of the first life, single-celled organisms, moving on, and they've existed all the way around. Next up are eukaryotes. Those started in the early Proterozoic, and then we had multicellular life, moving on to land, plants, and animals. So you can see what a small percentage of Earth's history we've actually been occupied by plants and animals. But this is just to familiarize you with the language that's used and also the scale of time that we're dealing with. The water cycle that we deal with is a lot shorter time scale. So this is just something that geologists look at. Another aspect of this slide is these images here. These are called paleogeographic reconstructions of Earth. So geologists have established what Earth looks like 600 million years ago. If you were to turn this into a globe, all of this landmass that's shown in brown would be one basically supercontinent. The rest of Earth would be ocean. That changes significantly through time. This other example here is 150 million years ago, and you can see there are several separate continents that cover the surface of Earth along with the oceans. So these continents have shifted and moved and created basins, filled basins, removed basins through time. So this interaction of the Earth has created a very complex history for both basins and for rocks. So next up, we're going to look at the geologic time related to Colorado. This is a different perspective of the geologic time scale, again, going from the oldest, the Precambrian, all the way up to the youngest, where we are at the very, very top of this scale. This is a graphical representation of Colorado's history. So starting off, we have Colorado's geologic foundation, about 2.7 billion years old. Those are the oldest rocks in Colorado. From there, we have oceans coming and going. We have mountain building. The ancestral Rocky Mountains were here about 300 million years ago. They're where the current Rocky Mountains are located, but those are not the same mountains that we see today. Those mountains eroded and filled in the DJ Basin. And then about 60 to 100 million years ago, we had the mountain building event that created the Rocky Mountains that we see today. So an incredible history in Colorado. Between those two mountain building events, we have dinosaurs evolving and then dinosaurs going extinct. And all of that is captured in the rocks in Colorado. How do we know all this? Well, one way that we know this is by looking at modern examples of what we see in processes, such as this river. So here's a river where we have the direction of the river is moving this way. And as the river moves, it erodes this side of the bank. So think about the energy of the river coming in. It's picking up sediment here. And as it moves along, it's going to deposit on the next turn that it makes. So these are called point bars. And it's basically just deposition from the previous cut bank where the river was eroding. You can actually see this in outcrops of rock. So this is the same situation where we have channel flowing kind of towards us. This is the cut of the channel into the underlying rock. And if you were to slice open this point bar, this is roughly what those sand grains would look like. In this case, they're just lithified and have become rock. So as a geologist, we look at what's going on in the modern and we apply it to the ancient. And from there, we can put together the geologic history of what we're looking at. These are, again, the paleogeographic maps. And these are key time slices. Karis will definitely go through these as they talk about the history of the Piceance Basin. But this is what Colorado looked like 75 million years ago. There was actually a seaway that connected the Gulf of Alaska to the Gulf of Mexico. And part of Colorado was covered by that ocean. Just 10 million years after that, the ocean was basically completely gone, and Colorado was covered predominantly by land. And again, we're using these tools of looking at the modern to understand the ancient to put those stories together. So next up is another view of time. So over here on the left, we have that same time scale going from 0, that's where we are up at the top, 66 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous, and 145 million years ago at the start of the Cretaceous. And each of these columns represent the rocks that exist in different Colorado basins. So for example, this is the San Juan Paradox Basin. And the colors represent the type of rocks, where the rocks have been deposited, and then the names of the rocks. For example, where you see orange, that means the rock is part of a continental sandstone. Where you see white, it means that nothing was deposited. So through time, at the beginning of the Cretaceous, there's no evidence of rock from that time in the San Juan Paradox Basin. So if you were to drill a well through these rocks, you would see the Burrow Canyon sitting right on top of the Morrison, even though the Morrison is more than 145 million years old, and the Burrow Canyon is several million years younger. So it's just kind of a gap in the geologic history. And every basin has a unique geologic history, and the geologists of Colorado have been going through this tremendous effort to try to understand it. And this is just a visual representation of that. So the purpose of this slide is to show the differences in each of those basins and the difference in the stratigraphic column or the stratigraphy of the basins. So again, we have the San Juan Paradox basins over here. We have the continental sandstones. We have coastal sandstones in yellow, and then the marine shales are shown by this teal color. Moving to the Piceance Basin, and again, this will be in a lot more detail shortly. We have those marine sandstones from when Colorado was covered by that ocean that connected the Gulf of Alaska to the Gulf of Mexico. But you have different geologic events happening after that. You actually have volcanics in the more recent history of the Piceance Basin that you don't see in other basins in Colorado. The Raton Basin has significant evidence of the laramide orogeny, or the building of our current Rocky Mountains. That's what this indicates here. And so you have different rocks in the Raton than you do in the Piceance. You don't have evidence of the Burrow Canyon, so you're missing a significant part of the lower Cretaceous. In the San Luis Valley, the laramide orogeny, the mountain building, completely erased the history of the Cretaceous, and so you're just left with much younger rocks. And then last, we have the DJ Basin. Again, you don't have that lower Cretaceous history captured in there. You have the seaway rocks from the upper Cretaceous actually sitting on the rocks that were deposited before the Cretaceous started. So each basin is completely unique and has a completely unique geologic history. And each of these different types of rocks has the capacity to interact with water in different ways, to potentially generate oil and gas. In the marine sections, you're going to have rocks that have the capacity to generate oil and gas. And those marine shales will have a different water chemistry and water footprint than you're going to get with rocks interacting with volcanics, or in this case, the Green River Formation, which is a lacustrine or from a lake. So each of these different rocks has the potential to possibly produce oil and gas, different quantities of oil and gas, different types of oil and gas, and will interact with water in a different way. So it's an extraordinarily complex system, and every single basin is unique and will have different oil, gas, and water fingerprints. Now looking at it on a statewide scale, again, we have our major basins, and then adding in those stratigraphic columns, you can get kind of a scale of how these changes occur over such a small area of the United States. So that is it. Thank you so much for listening and for your time. And now Christine and Nathan from Karis are going to do a really deep dive using this information to talk about the Piceance Basin.
Thanks, Kat. Super good presentation. Really appreciate that. Before we move on to Nathan and Christine, I'll throw it out to consortium members if anyone has any questions for Kat on her presentation. I'm seeing no hands, so you must have done a very good job. So appreciate that, Kat, and welcome Christine and Nathan, and looking forward to your presentation.
All right, thank you. Just wanted to check to make sure that you are able to hear me and to see me and my presentation.
We can see your presentation and we can see and hear you.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much, Chair Messner, for letting Kat jump in front of us. It will give everybody on the call a really clearer understanding of what we're talking about. So thank you for that. And thank you, Kat, for really teeing us up and giving us a little bit of background on the history of geology. And admittedly, nobody really does basic geology better than Kat in my life. So I've known her for a while, but I do know that she is fantastic at sharing that information. So I'll just start off, kind of give a highlight of what we're going to talk about, and then hand over to Nathan. And so Kat talked about it, the stratigraphy. We're going to talk a little bit about the well design over in the Piceance Basin specifically, get into our producing formations. We'll touch a little bit more in detail on the depositional environment of the Piceance Basin, bringing in some of those structural features that Kat mentioned, and then get into the hydrogeology and water systems of the Piceance Basin. We really want to highlight how it's unique compared to the other basins in the state and how it interacts with the rocks that are either source rocks for oil and gas or are the same rocks that we produce oil and gas out of, even though some areas use them as water or as water sources. Also want to talk about water rights and the relationships to operators. DWR, Ms. Kozloff talked about it a couple of months ago in a lot more detail, but I just wanted to highlight a few things as it ties to the water systems out in the Piceance, and then provide some closing comments. And so I am going to kick it over to Nathan Camella, who's one of our geologists here at Karis, and we work together closely, and he's been working these basins for quite a while. So Nathan, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christine, for that introduction. And Kat, that was a thoroughly great presentation. And man, I feel like you really built me up, and I don't know if I can deliver. But I'm going to give it a shot. So I'm a geologist here at Karis. Karis's operations are largely focused inside of the Piceance Basin. Kat called it out earlier, but we are in the northwest corner of it. It is a large sedimentary basin. We have rocks that are as old as the Devonian. We have rocks that are as young as the Tertiary. The stratigraphic column off to the right denotes all of the formations that are present inside the Piceance Basin. Don't worry, guys, I'm not going to go into all of them. There's a lot of them. But the thing that I specifically want to call out about the stratigraphic column is denoted in the key down in the lower right-hand side. So those little green dots that you see strewn throughout this column, these are reservoirs that produce oil. And the little white stars that you see, those are reservoirs that produce gas. And the little green S's that you see are source rocks. And source rocks are rocks that have the materials that, given the right temperatures and pressures, can generate hydrocarbons. The big takeaway that I want people to have from this is just that we have a very complicated system. And complicated systems are not unique to the Piceance Basin. I feel like most basins have a complicated stratigraphic and petroleum system inside of them. But I think the thing that's important to note here is that there are reservoirs, source rocks strewn throughout it, but specifically we have source rocks at the surface. So the Green River Formation, which was deposited during the Tertiary, these are the cliff formers that you see just north of Parachute and Rifle. They are source rocks. They are also a reservoir for both oil and natural gas. So yeah, these systems can just be not necessarily just one or the other. And then part of the the stratigraphic column that I'd like to speak to with more specificity is the Upper Cretaceous. And on the next slide, I have it broken out because that's the portion of the stratigraphic column that is more pertinent to Caris's day-to-day operations. So the reservoir that we produce from is called the Williams Fork, and I'm going to talk about it more with some specificity or expand on it more in some later slides. But for right now, I'd just like to give a brief overview of where it is and what the wellbore design looks like and how we get there. So we target the Williams Fork Formation and its natural gas reservoir. It's about 5,500 feet below the valley floor, and it's about 8,000 feet below our plateau. These are generalized depths based on the area that we're currently operating in. The fresh water that we encounter inside of the Piceance Basin is generally within about 500 feet of the surface. In some cases, it's a little bit deeper. Those are largely used for stock purposes. I'm not going to talk about the water chemistry inside of aquifers and how it changes as you get deeper into the basin. Christine's going to cover that in better detail in subsequent slides. So the way that we get to this reservoir is that we start drilling from surface, and then we reach about 3,000 feet. At about 3,000 feet is where we set surface casing. And casing is just a big steel pipe that we cement into the ground. That steel pipe is designed to protect everything outside of the wellbore from what's happening inside of the wellbore, and vice versa. After we cement the casing, our surface casing in place, we then drill down to the Rollins. The Rollins is our base section. Once we hit that point, we lower another steel pipe down all the way down to the TD to that Rollins, and then we cement that in place. After that's cemented in place, we will complete the well, and then the natural gas and the associated water with that natural gas will flow up through that production casing to surface. And the takeaway that I want you guys to have from that, and why I'm going into more detail about that, is that what's happening at surface, those aquifers specifically, are being protected by 2 steel pipes and 2 layers of cement. The other thing that's protecting what's happening at the surface, those aquifers at surface, is that we have about 3,500 feet of rock between where that lower aquifer is and where the top of our reservoir is. And the formation specifically that is acting as a seal between those two is called the Wasatch. It's 2,500 feet of shale and mud rock and a little bit of sandstone, and it acts as a pretty decent seal across the basin. And now that I've talked about our wellbore construction and the stratigraphy of what we operate, I'd like to talk about how those rocks were deposited. So during the late Cretaceous, we had the Farallon plate was subducting underneath the North American plate. When that plate was subducting, it caused a mountain building event, and that mountain building event created the severe mountain range off to the west. When those mountains were created, it created so much weight on the North American plate that it actually subducted, or it caused a portion of the plate to go so low that it went below sea level. And when that happened, it opened up a seaway between the North Pole and the Gulf of Mexico. This seaway was called the Interior Cretaceous Seaway. And this is the depositional system that allowed the rocks for the late Cretaceous to be deposited. And these rocks were deposited from Utah all the way into Kansas, Nebraska. So this was, at its peak, a fairly wide seaway. These mountains were getting eroded, and those acted as the sediment supply that were shed into that seaway and resulted in a variety of sedimentary rocks. And just because these rocks were deposited at the same time does not mean we had the same sedimentary rocks. The closer you are to the sediment supply off to the west, the more clastics you have inside of it. So more sandstones, more silt and shales. And as you get out into the seaway, that's where carbonates and more marine depositional systems start to take over. And again, I will cover the difference in depositional settings and a couple slides here. On the next slide, I would like to talk about how we also have differences in just structural settings. So after these rocks are deposited, like Kat was talking about, we have continuous plate movement. And those plate movements put continued stresses on all of these rocks. And they end up getting deformed. And so the way that these rocks present themselves in the subsurface is very different basin to basin. We can see that we have different levels of uplift. So what we have inside of where the San Rafael swell is, we have Paleozoic rocks at surface, where in the DJ, those rocks are tens of thousands of feet below the surface. Also, we have rocks that are, bent in what are called synclines and anticlines. So the structural setting of these basins changes the way that we operate inside of them, the way they get interpreted as well. And so with that, I'd like to move on and talk about the depositional systems for the late Cretaceous, and specifically the more important reservoirs inside of the Piceance and the DJ. And in the Piceance Basin, the Williams Fork is our primary reservoir. And the best analog that I have for that depositional environment would be the present day Mississippi Delta, and not the part of the Mississippi Delta that is out in the Gulf of Mexico, but the more landward portion of it, where you have meandering streams that are cutting back and forth. And Kat talked about the mechanisms that create point bars and oxbows. But the meandering of these streams create these isolated sandstone bodies that end up getting encased in shale. And so it creates this randomized assortment of sandstone lenses that are separated by these mudstones and shales from this fluvial system. It's a very chaotic and a very dynamic depositional system. If we compare that to what we see in the DJ Basin, the Niobrara chalks, those Niobrara chalks were deposited in about 100 feet of water. This was not as dynamic a system as what we have in the terrestrial setting. So these formations go on for tens and sometimes hundreds of miles. And the way that you can operate inside of those systems is very different. It lends itself very well to horizontal drilling because of the predictability of the rock. In the next slide, we have a kind of a caricature of what our typical operations look like. Because of the discontinuous nature of our sandstone bodies and their orientation, we end up doing directional drilling. So we have, dozens of wells at surface that we end up directionally drilling into a pattern that we feel like optimally will capture all of the natural gas inside of the sands in 1 square mile. This particular cartoon has these depicted as kind of these like floating potato chips that we capture with these vertical wells. Again, the typical reservoir depths that we have here are 5,500 to 8,000 feet deep. And one of the things that I think that this depiction does pretty well is it does a decent job of calling out the scale of between where our reservoir is and what's happening at surface. The top of our reservoir is denoted by these little sandstone bodies, and Christine was kind enough to go in and dummy in a line at the surface where we encounter the water. So again, those sandstone bodies that we're producing from down there, there's 2 layers of steel, 2 layers of concrete, but then there's also that 3,500 feet of rock that is separating what's happening at surface from what's happening down below. And if we've done our jobs correctly, then what we do down below should not be affecting what is happening on the surface. And that largely concludes my presentation. I'm going to toss it over to Christine to talk more in depth about what our freshwater and systems look like inside of the Piceance Basin. Thank you guys very much for this opportunity. Bye.
All right, Nathan, thank you so much. So we talked about the larger scale items when it comes to the geology and all of the differences. Well, we have some of those smaller scale differences though as well. And so it was touched on as far as what the Colorado River system looks like. So I've incorporated that into our presentation in the hydrogeologic system because it is a really important part of everything we do on a day-to-day basis. So we have the Colorado River, which is, the main part of the system, but we also have the Yampa River, which is in the northern part of our basin, and also downstream will eventually feed into the Colorado River. So just as far as terminology goes, the area in which we operate is called the Colorado Plateau and has been studied for decades as such. A lot of our references are specifically referring to the Colorado Plateau and how it is different to a lot of the other areas from a hydrogeologic standpoint. A couple things I wanted to highlight. Aquifer, when I use the term aquifer, and a lot of times in publication it's used this way as well, it just means a geologic formation that contains water. It is not necessarily potable or freshwater, which would be less than 500 in TDS levels. But I'm just talking about and a lot of the slides that I have will talk about an aquifer, even though that aquifer could contain what we would call produced water or more saline water. And so Nathan talked about it as far as drilling. We have the valleys and then we also have the plateaus. Well, that creates a very dramatic change in our climatic conditions out here. So our lower elevations are the valleys. They're semi-arid to desert with only 8 to 16 inches of precipitation per year. However, those higher elevation, they're kind of more alpine ecosystems in some areas, and over 30 inches of precipitation a year, snow upon snow during some winters, and that actually helps feed all of these river systems throughout the area. And we'll talk, people will talk about snowpack and how that impacts things. When we have a good year up on our plateaus, we know it's going to be a good year for the water supply. And so we have the surface water systems, and I've kind of thrown this sketch in. It's from the Groundwater Atlas of the United States. It is an older publication, but it's also a very relevant publication that hasn't changed a lot since then. So it's important to highlight, we have these alluvial systems that are very shallow groundwater. I call them here surficial aquifers. They're also known as tributary because they are directly connected to these surface waters, and they are treated as such. In that if there was a well here and you pull from it, it will over time have an impact on that surface water. But we also have a number of deeper aquifers down in the bedrock, and we've talked about it on our stratigraphic sections. I'll have another one coming up soon, that don't have any direct connection to the surface water. And some of those are fresh, generally less than 1,000 feet deep. And then some of them are brackish or saline. And so I did some research on the state well permit website and just kind of looked around for what the wells look like in this area. Typical domestic or stock water well depths are less than about 200 feet. A lot of them are down in the lower parts of the river, like near the river. I found some a little bit higher up, kind of towards the plateaus that are 350 to 500 feet. And they're listed mostly for stock wells because cattle and other types of livestock could have a little bit higher tolerance than humans have when it comes to TDS levels in the water. And so it's important to note that the Colorado River, we know it's the lifeblood of the Western Slope. The vast majority of our employees live and work out there. And as operators, we know this. We also know that that fresh water is precious. And so water recycling in the Piceance goes back over 20 years. And so getting back to one of these strat columns, it's really important to highlight, again, this difference in it's called a confining unit. So while there are some sands in there, there's a whole lot of shale or mud rock. And what those grains look like when you stack them on top of each other, they're kind of like little flat pieces and they just kind of smush up against each other. And because water molecules are so large, it really makes it hard for any water to move through those. So it confines any movement of water to either the upper part of the upper aquifer or the lower aquifer. And so we touched on this, the Parachute Creek member being one of the aquifers in the Piceance Basin that is typically accessed. It's important to note that this is also a formation that consists of oil shale, is what the terminology is typically called out in Western Colorado. So as we said, it is a source rock. So there are some areas in the basin where there's more methane, naturally occurring methane that falls into this Parachute Creek member. And where it's shallower, then you'll get a little bit more fresh water. It is also what's called a naucolite bearing zone. And there's commercially mined naucolite from these areas, this Green River Formation throughout Western Colorado and in other areas of the country as well. And so we have this 3,500 feet of confining layer, which protects this water from moving up here and vice versa. And then down here, we typically see that the quality of water does not meet drinking water standards. This is our producing formation. It's called the Mesa Verde, but the uppermost part is the Williams Fork, as Nathan mentioned. And we see brackish water to saline water, depending on where you are in the basin. If it's near an outcrop, you might see a little bit fresher water. However, where we operate, it's generally above 8 to 10,000 milligrams per liter, and it gets a lot more saline in other parts of the basin. So just taking a different side view of this, you look at the cross section of the Piceance Basin, even within the Green River Formation. This upper part is where they call the upper aquifer, which is where some of the fresher water is. This mahogany zone is the really rich oil shale zone. And you can see even within that Green River Formation, you get into a saline zone of an aquifer. So this is from the Colorado Groundwater Atlas. And you could see even in that freshwater Parachute Creek member, there are areas where we get to over 30,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids. And that's where we get kind of that more like saline, kind of water that you're not typically going to use for domestic or stock wells because the treatment of it or the depth of it will make it uneconomic to access. So there's a lot of variation depending on where you are in the basin. And some can be used for irrigation, some is used for stock, and some for domestic. So this is just a chart that shows kind of the deeper parts of the basin in this Mesa Verde or the Williams Fork, how you get deeper and you get a marked change in dissolved solids concentrations, which kind of defines what we're looking at as far as water quality. And I thought this was interesting. It's a World Health Organization study, and this is just looking at a taste test. And so as far as excellent tasting water, people typically will look for something less than 300 milligrams per liter TDS, and anything above 1,200 is unacceptable. And that's just based on human taste testing. And I just thought that was interesting that people have a very, keen assessment of what is good and what's not good. And when it comes to fresh water, less than 500 is the target that you're looking for. And so stepping over into this next piece, the Colorado water rights, as I mentioned, there was a previous discussion on this. A couple things I want to highlight is, of course, the prior appropriation doctrine, which is that first in time, first in right. So the Division of Water Resources actually receives monthly reports on how much water people use, especially from those surface water sources. So that information is monitored. It's important to note that people and organizations do have adjudicated water rights in water court that give them the right to access that fresh water. And when there is a shortage of fresh water in the system, calls are put on the river so that not everybody and anybody can pull water out of the river, but the priority goes to that oldest documented water right during those dry periods. So those systems are already in place that folks out there have water rights, and they can't just go ahead and pull water when it's a really dry year. So there are limitations. And so those appropriated water rights, if they were appropriated for industrial uses, they can be used for oil and gas. But again, those proper rights have to exist. You can't just go pull up to the river, pull some out that you need without the proper permissions. And so then the state as a whole is responsible for ensuring alignment with the interstate compacts, which gets way more in depth, but it is something that also drives what we do as a state and how much water we can access. There's also groundwater. And so there is a detailed system for groundwater rights for landowners, typically those shallower freshwater sources used for domestic or stock purposes or irrigation. And then that's going to be based on your land ownership area, the aquifer thickness, and that helps determine the pumping rate that you have the rights to. Those wells do need to be permitted. And once they are drilled, there's follow-up information upon the well completion. So that goes into these state systems. And so that information is all out there for people to access, even if there are monitoring wells in the state to monitor water quality or depth or water levels. Those are all out there as well. And I know Ms. Kozloff touched on this as well, but the non-tributary water requirements that are in place for produced water, this has been calculated that based on these maps, there was a hearing back in 2009, 2010, that mapped out where you can pump from, where that produced water does not impact any surface waters. And so those map boundaries are out there on the information marketplace. And so within those rules, it also discusses how for oil and gas, those water permits are not needed for oil and gas wells when those operations of the water is recycled for oil and gas operations within that same geologic basin. So there are limitations placed on that. And so I wanted to highlight these as they relate to the oil and gas operations in the Piceance Basin. And so just kind of rolling all of this stuff back together, Nathan and I were kind of, how can we tie this all back in as the consortium is looking at, how to address these different basins and the produced water around them. So some final comments that we put together, just highlighting, the significant variation across the basins. You've seen it in the ways of population. You're starting to hear it in the ways of geology, hydrogeology, some of the operations. That's where you're going to see all those differences across the state. And there are rules in place, and the recent deliverable that's in process right now helps to compile all of those to assist the operators in recycling produced water and having access to the fresh water if needed, and if there are the proper rights. So looking at all of these aspects, consideration should be given to those interaction of the rules across the agencies as they apply to produced water and freshwater usage. And in some cases, it's important to note that the use of recycled water may be limited in either a basin or at a location. And it could be because of how water interacts with the rocks in the formation, the amount of water that exists in the formation itself. So in some cases, formations might not produce as much water. There could be a specific volume for operations that might not be available due to infrastructure or lack of transportation options, or lack of storage in an area. And in some cases, and I think this is probably more common in other basins, but land use conflicts, landowner feedback, surface use requirements, they may conflict from one landowner to the next. So just kind of tying this all back together, the site-specific aspects will need to be considered as this consortium moves forward when it comes to produced water and recycled water. Are there any questions?
Thank you for the presentation. Certainly appreciate it. Unfortunately, consortium members, we do have to end at 1 o'clock, and so we're not going to have time for questions. If you do have questions, though, I would encourage you to forward them to Director Dalton, who will be able to reach out to Christine and Nathan and be able to get those questions answered. And we can get those questions answered as we have in previous presentations when we run out of time. But we really do appreciate the presentation and the time that you've given us here today. And to consortium members, really appreciate hanging in there through a long day. We did work on a lot of stuff and heard a lot of presentations, and it was a big day. So as always, if you have questions, comments, concerns about the meetings, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Director Dalton. And next meeting, hope is, I don't remember the date. Do you remember the date?
May 10th.
May 10th.
And it'll be, I'm sorry, it'll be in person in Aurora. And Nikki Wells will be hosting.
Great. And we'll get information out to folks. And thanks again, and have a great weekend. And appreciate all the work today. So thank you.
Thank you.